Jon Snow stood on a wind-swept bluff at the edge of the world, the salty tang of the narrow sea in his nostrils, his cloak snapping behind him like the banner of some new and unspoken cause. It was the cusp of autumn. The sky was strewn with long, ragged clouds that bore the threat of colder winds from the north, and the grass beneath his boots had already begun to yellow. Down the slope, beyond the rocky beach, ships waited in the bay, their sails and hulls battered by many crossings. He surveyed them with a cool, contemplative gaze. The sun was a pale silver disk, sliding across a firmament turned to slate, offering feeble warmth as it dipped toward the horizon. If he closed his eyes, he could almost imagine himself back at Castle Black, or upon the high vantage of Winterfell's walls. But this place was neither north nor south. It was a small cove off the coast where the north ended, and the sea paths to the free cities truly began. Of late, the cove had earned a new name, Snow's Landing. He had never asked for such an honor, but the folk who traveled with him, free folk, Northmen, even a handful from the Vale and beyond, had given it so. The world had changed beyond measure since the long night. The threat of the White Walkers had been vanquished. The living had triumphed, yet the scars left on the north and all of Westeros ran deep. What remained of the Seven Kingdoms found themselves in a precarious peace, each region cautious, battered, and eager to nurse its own wounds. Jon had wanted nothing more than quiet solitude. He had not desired crowns or glories. He had never yearned for titles or tributes. And yet, the burdens of leadership had a way of finding him. He had exiled himself, in a sense, beyond the wall at first. But soon, rumors had reached him that Westeros was in turmoil again. Political strife, lingering resentments, petty wars of lords who sought to fill the void in power. Fewer would dare to challenge the North, for it had proven its mettle in the battles against the dead. But there were always those who sought wealth, who sought to seize new lands, and who saw the craggy expanse of the North as a savage frontier to be tamed. Winterfell, though battered, remained the seat of the North. Sansa Stark, long-suffering and wise, held it together with her practical mind and unflinching dedication. She ruled as Lady of Winterfell in Jon's absence, counseling peace whenever possible but prepared for war if it came. Jon had known that the North was strong but not invincible. He also knew the free folk, those who had once been called wildlings, had pledged themselves to stand with him, not as subjects but as free men and women who recognized a leader worth following. Even Tormund Giantsbane, boisterous and full of ferocious pride, had proclaimed Jon a good man to follow. But the truth was, resources were few, and new threats loomed. The Iron Islands rebuilt their fleets with an eye on trade, and, maybe, plunder. Rival lords in the Westerlands eyed the coastline, while the Riverlands sought restitution for the wars that had marched across their fields. The Crownlands, still in the throes of forming a stable monarchy after so many shifting allegiances, remained in a fragile balance. The North needed allies. It needed something that no single region of Westeros could provide alone. Jon looked out at the water, remembering the stories Davos Seaworth had once told him of the free cities. Braavos, with its Titan and labyrinthine canals, Pentos with its wealthy magisters, Volantis and its ancient walls, the pleasure domes of Lys, the cunning merchants of Myr, and beyond. 1,000 tongues, 1,000 shifting allegiances across the sea. They were not of Westeros, but they had never truly been an ally nor a foe, not for the North in particular. Each city was its own power, and each kept to itself except when gold or prestige was on the line. Yet Jon sensed a possibility. Trade routes might ease the suffering of the North, help rebuild, help stave off the cyclical hunger that the long winters brought. But the free cities did not simply hand out alliances. Even Braavos, the most open of them, had secrets deeper than the darkest seas. If the North were to navigate that labyrinth, it would take more than a banner and an earnest plea. It would take cunning, a measured show of strength, and an offer so valuable none could refuse. It was Arya Stark who had first carried whispers of unrest in Braavos, unrest that might be turned to advantage. She had gone there briefly, years before, under the tutelage of the Faceless Men. Though her time among them had ended, she retained certain connections, certain hidden vantage points from which to observe. Through her, John had learned that the Iron Bank of Braavos sought to invest in stable powers, now that the Targaryen threat was gone, and the Lannisters had all but squandered their fortunes. The North, if properly represented, might offer a new partnership. And that was just one city. Pentos reeled under internal feuds between magisters. Myr and Lys faced pirate threats along their shipping lanes. Volantis sought to reassert old slaving roots in the aftermath of Daenerys Targaryen's downfall, only to find themselves short of muscle. Every city had troubles, and troubles could forge alliances as hot iron is forged into steel. So John did what he had been raised to do. He led. He called upon the small but hardy ships of the North, upon the more ragged vessels the free folk had seized in raids from Eastwatch and Hardhome, and he set about forming a modest navy, not for conquest but to travel, to show strength, to gather allies. He had no illusions that forging new treaties would be simple, yet he believed it could be done. The realm was tired of endless wars. People wanted a future that did not revolve around swords and betrayal. They wanted a realm where winter was not an annual threat of starvation, but a predictable season that communities could weather together. This had been the dream, even in the days of Eddard Stark. Now, perhaps, was the time to make it reality. He smelled salt on the wind, laced with the faint odor of pitch from the ships below. Behind him, Ghost padded silently, his pale fur nearly blending with the sky. John reached a gloved hand down to the direwolf's head, stroking gently behind one ear. Ghost had been his constant companion for so long, it was impossible to imagine forging a path without him. "We sail in the morning," John murmured. The wolf stared out at the bay, ears twitching at the cry of gulls. This was the next step in a journey that had already felt too long and too wearying for one lifetime. But John was no stranger to burdens. He had borne too many for too long to turn aside now. When dawn came, the ships slipped out of the cove. The water glowed, gold and pink, as the first rays of sunrise broke across the horizon. John stood on the deck of the largest vessel, a black hull with sails dyed a deep gray that bore the snarling direwolf of House Stark at their center. Half a dozen companions stood at his back. Tormund, with his red beard and broad grin. Davos Seaworth, ever the loyal counselor. Arya, whose eyes hid quiet secrets. A handful of northern knights, men John trusted with his life, oversaw the rigging. In the smaller ships behind, others he had rallied came along. Warriors from the free folk, a few enterprising merchants from White Harbor, looking to expand trade, and even a smattering of men from the Vale who had grown disillusioned with the politics of the South, and saw new opportunities in forging alliances across the narrow sea. Their crossing to Braavos was uneasy. A storm found them halfway across, lashing the decks with cold rain and spitting lightning across the skies. John thought of the old gods and the new, of how often nature seemed to conjure fury whenever his life took a new turn. But they endured. With Davos' keen eye for navigation and the sturdy build of the northern ships, they lost only one smaller vessel, a craft crewed by a dozen free folk that had drifted dangerously close to jagged rocks. John felt the bite of guilt when the bodies of those men and women failed to surface. The sea was an unforgiving mistress, and even the North's resilience could not spare them every tragedy. Yet they pressed on. They arrived in Braavos under a dreary sky, sails sagging, men and women exhausted from the harsh crossing, but relief warmed them as they passed beneath the looming shadow of the Titan, who stood sentinel at the mouth of the harbor, as he had for centuries, bellowing his silent welcome. At the quays, curious onlookers gathered. Braavos had seen all manner of vessels, from exotic war galleys to merchant ships from the Summer Isles. But to witness a flotilla bearing the sigil of the direwolf, escorted by scruffy warriors who might have been mistaken for pirates, was still a novelty. Braavos prided itself on its acceptance of outsiders, yet many a pair of eyes narrowed as Tormund strode down the gangplank, laughing heartily at the sight of all the tiny men scurrying around. John followed, quieter, Ghost at his side, ignoring the discomfited stares. A detachment of Bravosi officials arrived, lean, sharp-eyed men and women wearing embroidered cloaks. They greeted John stiffly, with a polite welcome that was thin as paper. But their leader, a smooth-voiced envoy named Noah, offered them accommodations, courtesy of the Sea Lord. This was a gesture of potential goodwill. John, uncomfortable with pomp, merely bowed his head in thanks. He had not come here to antagonize. They were led through the canals and winding streets, past tall, slender houses that seemed to crowd over the water, their foundations half submerged. The air smelled of brine, fish, and the faint hint of sewage that lingered beneath. Braavos was a city of twilight colors and suspicious glances behind half-shuttered windows. Yet it was also a city of music, art, and the unspoken interplay of wealth and power. Once they settled in a vast old mansion that had been lent to them, with gardens that backed onto a narrow canal, John wasted no time. He sought audience with the Iron Bank. He and Davos sat in a cold marble hall, dwarfed by columns as thick around as weirwood trunks, while a stern-faced banker studied them as though they were items to be appraised. They spoke of trade, of reconstruction, of how the North could repay loans once the shipping lanes prospered. The banker listened politely, but asked for collateral. Always collateral. In the coming days, John and his companions traveled across Braavos, forging small connections, speaking with merchants, negotiating prices for lumber, iron ore, and grain that the North sorely needed. Arya moved among the back alleys, gleaning bits of information. Rumors of a splinter group within Braavos' administration. Men who were plotting a separate expedition across the sea to secure new holdings in Westeros. Perhaps they hoped to claim a piece of the North. John realized that forging alliances would require more than trade deals. He needed to offer them a sense of shared destiny, a reason to invest in unity rather than mere conquest. In a city built on commerce, gold spoke the loudest, but so did fear. Fear of losing advantage, fear of missing a profitable opportunity. And John knew well how to wield both caution and enticement, even if it chafed his honorable instincts. Days turned to weeks. Negotiations in Braavos were slow, hindered by entrenched bureaucracies and old rivalries. Still, John's earnest demeanor, Davos' seasoned negotiating skills, and the tantalizing possibility of new trade routes into Westeros wore away the stony reserve of the Braavosi. An agreement began to form. The Iron Bank would fund a modest expansion of the North's harbor facilities at White Harbor, and in return, certain privileges would be granted to Braavosi merchants. This was the first brick in what John hoped would be a much larger edifice. Meanwhile, Arya confirmed that some of the officials who negotiated behind the Sea Lord's back plotted an expedition of their own, a small fleet that would slip into the North's western coasts in search of rumored silver deposits in the hills near Deepwood Motte. When John confronted Noah about it, the man grew pale. He denied any knowledge, but as the rumor spread, certain Braavosi elements lost their nerve. That expedition never sailed. At last, after many shrewd exchanges, John and his retinue prepared to leave Braavos with an agreement in hand. Nothing so grand as a formal alliance, but a promise of beneficial terms. They had established a rapport. The next step was to sail further south and visit Myr, Lys, and Pentos, each with its own labyrinth of politics. Every day that passed, John wondered if he was doing the right thing. He had left the North in Sansa's capable hands, but he feared the brewing troubles there. Winter had not fully receded. The fields still needed replanting. The roads had to be secured against bandits. Yet a voice inside him insisted this was the path forward. The North could not remain isolated forever. If they were to truly thrive, they needed allies that stretched beyond the constraints of the Seven Kingdoms. And perhaps if fortune smiled, he could craft a union that transcended old boundaries, a union strong enough to ensure the next generation would not face war at every turn. It took them another grueling voyage to reach Pentos, battered by storms that seemed to stalk them relentlessly. Pentos was as different from Braavos as fire was from ice. A sprawling city where wealthy magisters lounged in opulent mansions, feasting while their slaves toiled. It set Joan's teeth on edge. He had been reminded often that Daenerys Targaryen once fought to end slavery across the seas, but here it thrived in subtle forms, if not in the open auctions that had once filled the city squares. The magisters had learned to be cunning, to hide their transactions behind layers of indentured servitude and debt bonds. John despised it, but he needed their cooperation. Pentos was an essential hub of trade in Essos. If the North could secure a deal with Pentos, the free cities would take notice. He dined in the gilded halls of Magister Covaro, an aging man with silver-streaked hair and a smile as sly as a fox. The magister's table overflowed with spiced meats, bowls of fragrant rice, candied fruits, and copious wine served by silent servants whose eyes lingered on the floor. John could feel Tormund's indignation crackling in the air. The free folk had little patience for pomp, even less for the concept of servitude. Davos, ever the diplomat, kept the conversation to trade agreements, grain shipments, special tariffs, shipping lanes that Pentos might use to reach the North's newly reinforced harbors. Magister Covaro listened, sipped his wine, and offered sweet words that promised more talks. John tried to keep his voice level, his gaze steady, though his blood simmered. He wanted to demand an end to the twisted forms of slavery that still persisted here, but he knew that that would only drive Pentos away. After days of feasting and negotiation, Covaro revealed his ambition: a grand navy funded partly by the wealth of Pentos that would connect the western and eastern ends of the narrow sea more efficiently. He spoke of controlling certain straits and cutting out Volantis from profitable routes. In exchange for the North's cooperation, meaning safe harbor, ship supplies, and perhaps exclusive docking rights, he would provide substantial investment in the North's infrastructure, more than Bravos had offered. It was an enticing proposition. But John smelled the seeds of conflict. If Pentos made an overt move to dominate trade routes, Volantis would retaliate. Bravos might not stand idle, either. The Licini pirates would thrive amid such tension. Accepting Covaro's offer could plunge the region into a new far-reaching conflict. Was that the alliance John sought? A realm built on the skeleton of war. He struggled with the choice, confiding in Davos under the sanctuary of quiet hours. Arya sometimes vanished for a day or two, always returning with cryptic snippets of knowledge. Unrest among Covaro's own allies, lesser magisters who resented his power. Tormund just wanted a clear foe to fight, and the promise of a full belly for his people. The men of the North who had accompanied John were torn between suspicion of foreigners and the lure of wealth that might strengthen their homeland. John wrestled with it all. In the end, he met Magister Covaro again in private. There, he spoke plainly. The North would not become a pawn in another city's power games, but they would enter an agreement that guaranteed mutual prosperity. He proposed a narrower scope, limiting Pentos' naval ambitions to legitimate shipping routes, ensuring the North would not be dragged into war. Covaro, cunning as a snake, feigned insult, then accepted the terms with reluctance. They drank on it, sealed the arrangement in front of Covaro's assembled court. A ripple of unease spread among the lesser magisters. Some called John too bold. Others saw advantage in the North's new connections. But for now, the deal stood. Next came Mir, with its famed glassworkers and alchemists, a city whose wealth derived from cunning crafts and the secrets of scorching forges. The heat of the Mirish foundries felt oppressive compared to the North's crisp air. Deals were brokered for weapon steel, innovative creations that the North might use to defend its realm. The Mirish sought furs, timber, and some rumored secrets of dragonglass that had aided in the war against the dead. John found the Mirish to be suspicious, consumed with envy for other free cities, especially Lys and Tyrosh. Yet their thirst for wealth made them predictable. More coins changed hands, more agreements penned. With each city visited, John's party grew slightly larger. Merchants who saw opportunity, warriors from the free folk eager for more adventures, the occasional Bravosi or Pentoshi entrepreneur who believed in the North's potential. As months slipped by, John wrote regularly to Sansa, sending ravens with updates from each port. Her replies were concise but encouraging. The North held steady, with White Harbor bustling now that the shipping expansions had begun. Yet tensions rose in the west, near the Iron Islands. Sansa hinted that new threats might be forming, bands of raiders testing the coastline, perhaps incited by lords in the Westerlands who aimed to weaken the North. She urged John to hurry if he could, but she knew as well as he did that forging these alliances took time. In Lys, John encountered something more troubling: open talk of rebellion within the city's highest echelons. Lys was famous for its pleasure houses, for the intricate illusions of wealth and comfort it offered travelers. Beneath that veneer, it seethed with factional battles, powerful courtesans playing lords and ladies against each other. John cared little for the city's famed debauchery. He was more concerned with the band of Lyseni pirates terrorizing the sea routes north of Tyrosh. If the North's shipping lanes were to remain secure, those pirates had to be dealt with. Davos gleaned intelligence that these pirates might be under the patronage of certain Lyseni noble houses, eager to destabilize trade so they could sell protection. John confronted a council of Lyseni leaders. Men dressed in diaphanous silks lounged on divans, swirling perfumed wines. His plea was blunt: clamp down on piracy, or the North would withhold any future alliances. They were outraged at his directness, but the seeds of concession were planted. Despite all their posturing, these Lyseni lords realized that a stable maritime alliance could bring them more wealth in the long run than any short-term pirate profits. Amid these negotiations, John found himself haunted by questions. Who was he to unite these disparate powers? He was a bastard of House Stark, the reluctant king in the North once, now forging something larger. He had never sought to be an emperor or a conqueror. Yet the more he looked at maps, the more he spoke with lords and magisters, the more he recognized the shape of a future that transcended the old lines of Westeros and Essos. Perhaps, he thought, these free cities had always remained aloof because Westeros was too fractured, too consumed by civil wars. Now, with the Targaryen dream extinguished, with the Lannisters fallen from grace, with the Baratheons a scattered memory, the North stood as a symbol of resilience and of a new possibility. There was a path here, one that might forge an empire in truth. An empire not built on conquest and subjugation, but on alliances, on shared interests, on mutual defense. His final stop was Volantis, the oldest of the free cities, steeped in tradition, powerful in its own right, still grappling with the loss of the old Valyrian ways. Jon's arrival stirred controversy. Some remembered Daenerys Targaryen's past attempts to liberate slaves, leading to chaos in Volantis. The city's ruling triarchs were divided, with one faction calling for renewed expansion into Slaver's Bay, while another feared the cost of open warfare. Negotiating with them was a maddening dance of half-truths and fiery rhetoric. They demanded the North's endorsement if they were to maintain their autonomy without further foreign interference. But they offered rich trade in exchange, exotic goods from the East, precious metals, knowledge gleaned from old Valyrian lore. Jon pressed them on their stance towards slavery, but they deftly skirted the issue, claiming it was an internal matter. He gritted his teeth and pushed for guarantees that any laborers sent to the North from Volantis would be freemen, not chattel. After days of argument, the Triarchs grudgingly agreed to supply only free workers, but Jon knew how precarious such a promise was in practice. Still, it was another step. By the time he set sail to return to Westeros, half a year had slipped through his hands. He had forged a web of tentative arrangements, partial treaties, guarded promises. More progress than anyone would have predicted. The success or failure of these ventures depended on trust that was fragile as spun glass. But at least the tapestry was woven. The North's name was now spoken in the halls of Braavos, Pentos, Myr, Lys, and Volantis with a new measure of respect. Jon had not turned the free cities into a single alliance, but they now recognized him as a force. They called him the White Wolf, the man who had led the living against the dead and won, the king in the North who spoke of trade and unity instead of war and dominion. It was on that final voyage that the storms seemed to abate, as if giving him a reprieve. The seas calmed, and the reflection of the sky shimmered on the water. Jon found moments of silent contemplation, standing at the prow, Ghost beside him, thinking about what awaited them at home. When at last White Harbor's harbor walls came into view, he felt a bittersweet relief. The city bustled with new construction, scaffolds along the docks, half-finished expansions funded by the Bravozy Bank, northern banners mixed with foreign merchant flags. He even spied a few Pentoshi vessels anchored, their sails a bright turquoise. Sansa was waiting on the docks. She looked changed, thinner, more stoic, yet with a certain hardened grace. Her red hair was pinned in an intricate style that reminded him faintly of their mother, Lady Catelyn. The moment he stepped onto the pier, Sansa embraced him fiercely. "You've been gone too long," she said, voice thick with emotion. He murmured her name, feeling the ache of all that time spent apart. Then she took him by the hand and led him through the throng of people crowding the docks, Tormund grumbling all the while about wanting mead, Davos trailing behind. They gathered in a quiet office in the stronghold that overlooked the harbor. Sansa, her advisors, and some lesser lords of the north met with Jon and his retinue. Over cups of spiced wine they spoke of what had transpired while he was away. Bands of raiders on the western coasts had become more organized, attacking small villages near the stony shore. Survivors claimed these marauders bore the Kraken sigil of House Greyjoy, but Sansa suspected other forces might be at play. The Vale remained neutral, distant, led now by Lord Royce, who had grown increasingly wary of the North's growing power. The Crownlands were in disarray, with King Bran the Broken's court, in King's Landing, preoccupied by endless squabbles among southern lords. Jon set his jaw. It seemed the old patterns of conflict were surfacing again. But now, there was a difference. The North was not alone in the world. If push came to shove, Jon could call upon the alliances he had sowed in Essos, tenuous though they were. No doubt it would still require delicate maneuvering, but that was the reality of forging something new, something beyond a single kingdom. And in that moment, an inkling took root in Jon's mind. Perhaps what the North needed was not just a series of trade deals and pacts of non-aggression. Perhaps it needed a truly unified empire, bridging the gap between Westeros and Essos. An empire that would overshadow the petty spats of smaller lords and stand as a bulwark against any future horror that threatened humankind, be it White Walkers or the greed of men. At first he spoke of this idea only to Sansa. She listened, eyes narrowed in thought. "You've begun something," she said. "But if you speak too openly of an empire, you risk alarming all of Westeros. The lords might see you as a conqueror, another Aegon Targaryen come to unite the realm under force of arms." Jon nodded. "I don't want to conquer. I want cooperation." Her mouth curved in a wan smile. "We Starks have always wanted peace, yet the world thrusts war upon us. If you proceed, be prepared for challenges. The rest of Westeros may not stand aside and allow the North to become more powerful. Nor will all of the free cities remain content to be co-equal part." He gripped her hand. "I know. But I can't turn back now. We've come too far." Now. While they conferred, trouble erupted in the west. Raiders attacked Deepwood Motte and burned farmland. Letters arrived, telling of families forced to flee into the forests. Glover men took up arms, but found themselves outmatched by a cunning enemy that struck swiftly and retreated to the rocky shores. Jon knew there was no time for hesitation. He rallied forces, calling upon Northmen from Winterfell, and Tormund led a band of free folk warriors alongside them. They marched westward, determined to end the raids. Days turned to weeks of pursuit, clashing with small pockets of marauders, capturing a few who revealed that they indeed flew the Kraken banner under the command of a rogue Ironborn captain named Carol Pike. Yet the prisoners also hinted at something more. Behind the Ironborn raids might lie wealth from certain lords in the Westerlands, eager to sow chaos in the north. Riding through the dense forests near Deepwood Motte, Jon felt as though he were stepping back into the war-torn years of his youth. Houses Glover, Mormont, and Tallhart joined the campaign, forming a united force. The land bore scars from the White Walkers' advance years ago, and now new scars etched themselves along the edges of farmland, torched by raiders. Jon's outriders eventually cornered the Ironborn near a rocky cove at the foot of towering cliffs. Battle ensued. Steel met steel in the pounding surf. Tormund roared as he hewed down a pair of raiders. Northern archers, loosed volleys from above. Carroll Pike, a gaunt man with cruel eyes, bellowed defiance as he stood among his men, cutting down 2 Glover spearmen. But the North's numbers were too great, and soon the raiders had nowhere to flee but into the sea. The tide turned red with blood as the Ironborn tried to launch their longboats, only to be swarmed by Northmen who boarded and slew them. Ghost leapt at Pike, teeth bared, and though the Ironborn captain tried to fend off the direwolf, John was upon him in moments. Their swords clashed and John disarmed him. Pike spat curses even as John pressed Longclaw's point to his throat. "What lord pays you?" John demanded, voice cold as the northern wind. Pike refused to speak, but the captured men had looser tongues. They named a minor lord in the Westerlands, Lord Ammon Clifton, who, seeking to endear himself to more powerful factions, had hired Ironborn sell sales to weaken the North. There was even talk that some Bravosi gold might have been involved, though that part remained murky. John's teeth clenched. So soon after forging a precarious relationship with Bravos, he faced the possibility that some branch of Bravosi interests was funding aggression against him. He realized that in the politics of the free cities not all moved in lockstep with official policy. Factions within factions, some of whom would sabotage the North's ascendancy if they saw profit in it. He dispatched ravens to Winterfell and White Harbor, instructing them to remain vigilant. Then he tried the Ironborn prisoners. Some accepted mercy, those who had been forced into service or claimed they were only following orders. Others were executed for their crimes. As for Carroll Pike, John took him back to Deepwood Motte in chains. He let the Glovers decide his fate, and Lord Glover, grieving for the farmers and villagers lost, pronounced a death sentence. John did not intervene. Justice had to be served. When at last the raiding threat was snuffed out, the North breathed a sigh of relief, but the sense of calm was short-lived. John's thoughts turned again to the idea of forging a larger union, an empire that could stand against such underhanded attacks. Westeros was fractured, and the free cities were labyrinthine. What if there were a structure that rose above petty lords and scattered powers, a structure built with alliances strong enough that no single city or house would dare sabotage it? He voiced these thoughts to Sansa upon returning to Winterfell. She listened carefully. "Unity?" she said. "Under a single banner, bridging east and west?" John nodded. "We'd need more than treaties. We'd need loyalty, true loyalty, perhaps sealed by something stronger than commerce alone. But I don't know how to begin. The Targaryens once united the 7 kingdoms, but they had dragons and conquest. We have only alliances." Arya, who had quietly joined them, offered a rare insight. "Alliances can be more binding than fear," she said. "If we offer them something they value more than gold or power, security, a place to prosper, they might be eager to join. People are weary of endless conflict. We show them a vision of stability." Sansa added, "But you must tread carefully. The moment you proclaim yourself an emperor, the other regions of Westeros will see you as a threat, and the free cities might break from you if they sense you overreach." Jon sighed. "Then I won't proclaim anything yet. I'll let our actions speak. If we can demonstrate real stability here in the North, and if the new trade routes flourish, our strength will grow. In time, if the southern kingdoms remain divided, maybe they'll come to us rather than the other way around. And across the sea, the free cities might gravitate toward an alliance that protects them from piracy and unscrupulous lords." So he poured his energies into fortifying the North. White Harbor's expansions continued with Bravosi funding. Pentos dispatched a small flotilla of merchant ships that began to ply the route, bringing goods from across the sea, exotic spices, fabrics, and precious metals. In exchange, they carried back timber, pelts, and iron from the North. Irish craftsmen arrived, setting up workshops in White Harbor to produce innovative steel and glass goods, forging a new center of craft. Word spread that the North was becoming a hub of commerce, that it was not just the frozen wasteland some Southerners believed. Bit by bit, the North's prestige grew. Sansa governed Winterfell and the surrounding lands with a fair yet firm hand, focusing on rebuilding farmland and ensuring no one starved through the next winter. Tormund and his free folk settled pockets of land granted to them, forging an uneasy but gradually improving friendship with local Northmen. However, success rarely proceeded without challenge. Rumors spread throughout Westeros that Jon Snow was building a personal empire, that he was forging a realm that could rival the old Targaryen dominion. Lords from the Reach, the Stormlands, and Dorne began to whisper about northern ambition. The Vale grew colder, refusing to sign trade accords with the North or allow safe passage of goods across their roads. Some even rumored that the newly stabilized Crownlands might take action to prevent the North from overshadowing King's Landing. But King Bran was not an absolute monarch. His power depended on the Great Council and the support of each region. So for the time being, no open hostilities materialized. They watched, they waited, unsure if the North would truly overstep. Word also arrived from Essos that factions within Braavos and Pentos grumbled about the deals struck with the North. Some believed they were getting the poorer side of the bargain, others feared losing their autonomy if a more robust alliance formed. Meanwhile, Lys was rife with civil strife, as competing noble families jockeyed for advantage. Myr's relationships with Tyrosh and Volantis simmered with suspicion. Every city, every territory seemed perched on a knife's edge, capable of tipping toward prosperity or war. It was in this climate that Jon, with Sansa's counsel, decided to host a grand conference in White Harbor. Invitations were sent to all of the free cities, to the lords of Westeros, to King Bran himself. The stated goal: to discuss establishing a stable network of trade and defense that would benefit all. Many doubted the success of such a summit, but curiosity and caution drove them to attend. One by one, ships arrived in White Harbor's Bay. Braavosi bankers in black robes, Pentoshi magisters in bright silks, Myrish craftsmen, Lyseni nobles wearing gauzy finery. From Westeros came lords of the Westerlands, the Riverlands, even a delegate from the Iron Islands. The Vale sent a low-ranking knight with no authority, a clear sign of their tepid stance. King Bran did not come in person, but dispatched Tyrion Lannister, his hand, to observe and report. White Harbor bustled with more foreign tongues than it had ever seen. The ancient city groaned under the weight of so many visitors, but Sansa had organized it meticulously, lodging delegates in repurposed mansions, ensuring guards patrolled the streets day and night to keep the peace. Arya flitted among them in disguise, picking up tidbits of conversation. Ghost prowled the docks, a silent white sentinel. Jon himself moved from meeting to meeting, forging connections, trying to ease tensions. The atmosphere was tense, but hopeful. At the grand opening feast, held in a newly constructed hall near the docks, Jon stood at the head of a long table, flanked by Sansa on one side and Tyrion on the other. He looked out at the gathered throng of highborn individuals, many of whom did not entirely trust one another. With measured calm, he spoke about the hardships their world had endured. The long night, the wars that followed, the countless innocents who had perished. He spoke of the need for unity, of how men and women across the sea and across the realm deserved a chance to live without constant fear. He detailed how the North's new trade routes had revitalized struggling villages, how knowledge shared from Essos had improved farming techniques and forging methods. He did not speak of forming an empire. Instead, he painted a vision of a grand alliance that spanned both continents, each city and kingdom retaining its sovereignty but pledging mutual support in times of crisis. If enough leaders saw the benefits, they could formalize the arrangement. Tyrion, sipping his wine, studied the gathering with a wry smile. Jon had no doubt the Lannister was weighing every word, looking for angles. But for the moment, he seemed supportive. Tyrion raised a toast to peace and prosperity, acknowledging the North's efforts. Magister Kovaro of Pentos extolled the advantages his city had gained, though he couched his praise in careful language, lest his rivals see him as too deferential. Braavosi bankers murmured among themselves, acknowledging the successful returns on their White Harbor investments. A Lyseni noblewoman, Lady Exhay, who was rumored to wield considerable influence back home, expressed interest in establishing more robust shipping lanes. The Myrish envoys boasted of new markets for their goods. Even a sullen iron-born lordling, Harag Harlaw, admitted that the Iron Islands might benefit from peaceful trade, though he tried to sound unimpressed. Yet for all the polite words and half-smiles, John felt the undercurrents of suspicion. The next day, they convened in smaller councils, trying to draft the outlines of a formal pact. Sansa oversaw logistics with an iron hand, ensuring no faction dominated the conversation. Tyrion served as something of a mediator, suggesting wording for charters that might appeal to both Westerosi and Essosi parties. The plan was to create a framework for mutual defense against piracy and external threats, as well as standardized trade tariffs that would make commerce smoother. Every city and kingdom would keep its sovereignty, its right to govern as it saw fit, but they would pledge not to war upon each other, and they would share certain resources in times of dire need. Day by day, they inched closer to an accord. But tensions flared when the envoy from Volantis demanded that their old practice of free labor exchange be recognized, which many recognized as a euphemism for debt slavery. The North, still influenced by Daenerys' legacy of liberation, balked at the notion. Another dispute erupted over which currency would be used for official tariffs, the coin of the Crownlands or the iron tokens of Braavos. The Lyseni demanded assurances that their ships would not be taxed when docking in White Harbor, while the Marish insisted on some form of regulation to prevent Lys from undercutting them. The entire negotiation felt like building a house of cards, each piece reliant on the balance of others, threatened by the slightest breeze of hostility. Jon took heart that no one had walked out yet. That alone was progress. In the background, he knew certain conspiracies might be forming. He suspected that some envoys tried to sabotage the conference in secret. Arya whispered of quiet meetings after dark, exchanges of coin. Tormund, never one for subtlety, threatened to smash any sly plotters. But Jon reined him in, determined to see these talks through with as much diplomacy as possible. At one point, Tyrion pulled Jon aside. They stood on a balcony overlooking the harbor, the midday sun reflecting off the water. Tyrion's face was thoughtful. "You're doing something remarkable here, Jon," he said softly. "Something that no Targaryen, no Lannister, no Baratheon, no Tully, no Tyrell ever managed to do. Uniting people who despise being united." Jon exhaled. "It feels like it could collapse at any moment." Tyrion nodded. "It might. But if you manage this feat, you'll change the course of history. You might not call yourself an emperor, but they'll call you that if this succeeds. You realize that, don't you?" Jon's gaze was distant, fixed on the gulls soaring above the masts of docked ships. "I don't want a crown. I've worn one and it brought nothing but grief." Tyrion smirked wryly. "Crowns have a habit of finding those who least desire them." He placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Keep forging forward. You have good instincts. And you have Sansa, who is far more cunning than people give her credit for. If there's one person who can spot a hidden trap, it's your sister." Bolstered by these words, Jon returned to the negotiations with renewed determination. He hammered out compromise after compromise, eased squabbles, and leveraged the goodwill he built with certain factions in Braavos and Pentos. Envoys who grew frustrated found themselves cajoled by benefits they stood to lose if they stormed out. Slowly a fragile treaty took shape. They called it the White Harbor Concord. It would bind each signatory to respect mutual trade privileges, to contribute to a joint anti-piracy fleet, and to refrain from aggression against any other signatory. Volantis ultimately relented on its demand for free labor exchange, though they reserved the right to settle disputes about foreign workers under their own courts. A compromise that left many unsatisfied, but it was better than endorsement of slavery. The Mirish, Lyseni, and Pentoshi hammered out a tiered tariff system. Braavos claimed the right to mediate financial disputes. Tyrion, representing King Bran, added language that the Crownlands, along with the other southern kingdoms, might join later if they chose. Meanwhile, the North's role was pivotal but not explicitly supreme, which helped assuage the fears of those who suspected Jon Snow of seeking absolute power. The final day of the summit dawned cold and clear, the crisp wind carrying the smell of the sea. Delegates gathered in the hall to sign the White Harbor Concord. Sansa oversaw the proceedings with measured formality. Magister Covaro, representing Pentos, set his name to the parchment with a flourish. The Bravosi banker affixed a seal of black wax. The Liceni noblewoman made a small show of reluctance, but signed nonetheless. The Mirish delegates, muttering in their language, put their signatures down. The Volantine Triarch's envoy, stiff-lipped, complied. Tyrion endorsed it in the name of King Bran, albeit with carefully phrased reservations, leaving room for future adjustments. Lastly, Jon affixed his name on behalf of the North. Each signatory's seal glimmered on the document. A hush fell, as the hall seemed to reverberate with the weight of the moment. When the assembled crowd dispersed into subdued celebration, Arya sidled up to Jon with a half-smile. "You've done it," she said. He shook his head, staring at the parchment still laid on the table. "We've done something, but the real test begins now. Will they honor it, or will it unravel at the first challenge?" Arya's expression held a spark of defiance. "If it unravels, we'll stitch it back together. That's who we are. We don't give up." She gave him a playful jab to the arm, reminding him of the tomboyish girl she had once been. "Besides, you have a knack for doing the impossible." Jon smiled, albeit faintly. He wondered if this was how King Aegon had felt after forging the Seven Kingdoms, exhausted, hopeful, wary. Only Jon had not done it through dragonfire. He had done it through alliances, through persuasion, through compromise. That night, a modest feast was held to celebrate. No wild excess, for the North remembered the cost of feeding so many mouths. But the delegates feasted on roasted boar, hearty stews and warm bread, all accompanied by songs of the North and the free cities. One Bravosi minstrel sang a ballad about the Titan that towered over the sea, weaving in verses about the white wolf who had ventured forth to brave us. A Liceni bard performed an exotic dance that enthralled the crowd. Despite differences and old grudges, for that night, they laughed together, as though some fragile sense of camaraderie had taken root. When the delegates departed over the following days, Jon felt the tension in his heart remain. This was not a final victory. It was a beginning. The White Harbor Concord could be the seed of something far more ambitious, a realm that transcended the narrow definitions of Westeros and Essos. Sansa recognized the precarious nature of their creation, but she also saw the possibility for growth. Over the months that followed, they worked tirelessly to implement the terms of the treaty. Joint patrols in the Narrow Sea reduced pirate activity. Trade flowed more freely, with Bravosi and Pentoshi ships anchoring regularly in White Harbor, boosting prosperity in the surrounding lands. Marish artisans introduced new techniques to northern blacksmiths. Liceni merchants opened small enclaves within White Harbor's harbor district. Volantine caravans brought eastern goods overland to the sea, albeit warily. News reached King's Landing, and Tyrion's reports must have swayed King Bran, for soon a second delegation arrived, expressing tentative interest in closer cooperation. Lords of the Westerlands and the Reach sent cautious envoys, curious to see if they too might profit from the North's success. Even the Vale, which had remained aloof, showed cracks in its resistance, with some lesser lords sneaking across to White Harbor to sign private trade deals. Jon began to realize that if they maintained this momentum, eventually the rest of Westeros would fall in line. Not by threat of steel, but by the enticement of shared prosperity. Yet looming shadows threatened to upset everything. Among them, the possibility that a single spark of treachery in the free cities could ignite war. In Braavos, the Iron Bank was not monolithic. Various factions could withdraw support. In Pentos, a rival magister to Covaro could rise and undo the treaties. Lys, perpetually unstable, might slip back into civil strife. Volantis still chafed at restrictions on slave labor. Any one of these issues could unravel the tapestry. Within Westeros, certain lords would not sit idly by while the North accumulated wealth and influence. There would be attempts at sabotage, infiltration, perhaps even open war. Jon confronted these realities with the same steady resolve that had carried him through the war against the dead. He bolstered White Harbor's defenses, forging an alliance with the free folk to serve as maritime scouts along the frigid northern coasts. He tasked Sansa with training a new generation of stewards, accountants, and negotiators, so the North would not be outmaneuvered by wily Essos merchants. He consulted Davos on how best to navigate shifting political currents, and listened to Tyrion's advice, though the Lannisters' counsel sometimes served King Bran's interests as much as Jon's. And he permitted Arya to move freely, gleaning secrets that might give them warning of treachery before it became a noose around their necks. In quiet moments, Jon felt overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what they were attempting. He remembered the boy he had once been, standing in the courtyard of Winterfell, uncertain of his place in the world. He thought of Ygritte, the free-folk woman who had taught him a new perspective, and of Daenerys Targaryen, who had once believed she would break the wheel of tyranny. He wondered if his own effort now was the true fulfillment of that aspiration, uniting East and West not through dragons but through alliances of necessity and hope. He took no crown. He declared no official empire. But the people in White Harbor and beyond began to whisper. The North was no longer a mere kingdom. It was the seat of a budding confederation that might one day rival any empire of old. The moniker of Emperor chased Jon like a shadow, whispered by foreign captains and local smallfolk alike. He bristled at it, always insisting he was but a protector of the North, a facilitator of alliances. Yet the shape of history was rarely guided by one's protestations. If the alliances held, if the White Harbor Concord deepened, if the Southern Lords joined in, then in practice, if not in name, Jon Snow would stand as the leader of a realm that spanned continents. When the next winter arrived, it was less harsh than feared. Trade continued to flow, albeit slowed by ice-choked harbors. The Mirish invented a method of heating small greenhouses that allowed the North to grow hardy vegetables year-round, mitigating the worst of the shortages. Braavosi coin funded new roads to connect White Harbor to inland holdings, enabling an easier transport of goods. Pentoshi ships delivered citrus fruits and preserves that helped stave off scurvy among northern sailors. Each exchange further cemented the Concord, and with a common stake in safe shipping lanes, the signatories patrolled the seas together, driving down piracy. From across the narrow sea, emissaries from Korth and the Summer Isles took note of this new axis of power. Overland caravans began to appear from the east, carrying spices and curiosities from beyond the Red Waste. With each new connection, a subtle web of influence spread outward from the north. Jon recognized that with each bond they grew stronger, yet also more entangled in far-flung affairs. The complexities of maintaining a fragile balance multiplied, but so too did their capacity for resilience. Years passed. Children in the north grew up never knowing the hunger of the worst winters, never seeing foreign merchants as strange. Gaps between the free folk and the kneelers narrowed as they traded goods and stories. In Braavos, young bankers learned that White Harbor was an equal seat of commerce, not a backwater. In Pentos, the magisters spoke of the new northern markets with a mixture of envy and admiration. In Myr, blacksmiths and artisans found profitable patronage. In Lys, rival houses feuded but could not deny the gold that poured in. In Volantis, the old guard clung to tradition, but the economic benefits of the Concord made them pause any rash moves to expand slavery. All the while, Tyrion Lannister negotiated for King Bran, ensuring the Crownlands had a foothold in the new order, though the southern lords remained fractious. Jon himself saw gray creeping into his hair. The lines of care etched deeper into his face. He continued to travel, sometimes by ship to Braavos or Pentos, sometimes south to meet with lords in the Reach or the Stormlands, urging them to see reason in joining the Concord. He never forced their hands. He offered trade incentives, mutual defense pacts, chances to share in the prosperity. Some accepted. Some resisted. Step by step the vision spread. Occasionally a crisis flared up, a renewed pirate threat or a local war in the free cities. But each time, the signatories recognized that their collective power outweighed any single enemy. They deployed joint fleets. They enforced trade embargoes on the aggressor. Slowly, a pattern emerged. If you were inside the Concord, you reaped benefits and protection. If you remained outside, you risked isolation. Over time, even the naysayers bent, for gold and security often speak louder than pride. On the day John returned to Winterfell, after a prolonged journey through the Westerlands, where he had swayed a few more lords to the Concord, he found the courtyard full of children practicing archery. He paused, remembering how he and Robb once competed there. Sansa stood by, watching a young group of children release arrows at practice butts. She smiled when John approached. He embraced her, feeling the warmth of home. In that moment, he understood that the North he had once known was transformed, not lost. It was still the seat of honor, resilience, and family, but now it welcomed voices and faces from across the sea. It was bigger in spirit than it had ever been. By the time ghost stories about the others had faded to half-remembered tales, the White Harbor Concord had grown into a formidable institution. It had a rotating council composed of representatives from each signatory city or kingdom, meeting twice a year in White Harbor or Bravos. Common laws governing piracy and commerce developed. Cultural exchanges flourished, with poets from Lias performing in Winterfell's Great Hall, while northern storytellers enthralled audiences in Pentos. Marriages between houses of Westeros and merchant families of Essos began to occur, binding lines of kinship across the sea. The unstoppable momentum of these changes made war between the signatories increasingly unthinkable. Still, John never allowed himself to become complacent. He had witnessed how quickly alliances could crumble if tested by fear or ambition. He also knew that somewhere, some powerful individuals would forever chafe at unity, seeking to tear it down for personal gain. But every year that passed without major conflict was a triumph. He did not call himself a king or an emperor. The realm called him many things: the White Wolf, the Northern Dragon Slayer, the one who brought East and West together. He accepted the titles graciously, but never truly embraced them. He remained who he was at heart, a protector of the realm, born of the North, shaped by duty and sacrifice. In the evening, with the wind sighing through the ancient weirwood trees in the God's Wood of Winterfell, John knelt before the heart tree, ghost at his side. He thought of all the friends he had lost, the battles fought, the loves and loyalties forged. He murmured a silent prayer to the old gods to watch over this fragile piece he had helped to create. The face on the tree stared back, solemn and watchful. Rising, John gazed at the stars. A mosaic of alliances stretched across the sea, bridging worlds once separate. As the cold northern breeze caressed his hair, he allowed himself to hope that this unity might endure, that the children of tomorrow might grow up in a realm where war was not the constant drumbeat of life, where free men and women from both sides of the narrow sea could shape their own destinies. That dream was a hard-won gift, and if it bore the name Empire one day, let it be so. But Jon Snow would forever remember the cost, and forever guard against the seeds of tyranny that could sprout in any empire's heart. He would stand, resolute as the direwolf sigil of House Stark, silently vowing that the realm he had helped forge would never forget the lessons of the long night. In unity, they had survived the storm of ice and death. Perhaps in unity, they could build a future worthy of those sacrifices, a future where North and free cities, East and West, rose as one people, stronger than any who had come before. Time wore on. The North's winters came and went with a little less severity each time, or so it seemed to those who could remember the starving years. Ships continued to arrive from across the narrow sea, bearing goods from Bravos, Pentos, Mirrorless, and even Volantis. Some of the vessels carried strange flags and unfamiliar faces, emissaries from the Summer Isles or travelers from as far away as Korth, drawn by curiosity to see this new realm that was neither wholly Westeros nor entirely Essos, but a convergence of the two. Along White Harbor's docks, the bustle of 100 tongues interwove in a chaotic tapestry of commerce. Northern children dashed through the crowds, wide-eyed at the exotic sights. Korthine captains in embroidered robes, Bravosi Street performers juggling knives, Lysani dignitaries striding by in near-transparent silks. All around them rose the smell of smoke from the ever-present forges, the tang of salt from the harbor, and the aroma of cooking spices once unknown in the north. Jon Snow walked among them almost unnoticed, dressed in simple leathers and a dark cloak pinned with the direwolf sigil. Occasionally, someone would recognize him. The White Wolf, the quiet figure behind these sweeping changes, and they would bow or call out a respectful greeting. He would nod politely, grateful that he did not inspire the frenzied adoration a Targaryen dragonlord might once have incited. His renown was quieter. He was not a conqueror on horseback, not a man of flamboyant gestures. Those who approached him did so with curiosity and a measure of reverence, for they sensed that in his unassuming composure lay a power that had shaped the future of nations. He observed the construction of a new set of warehouses near the harbor. Pentoshi coin had funded them, but northern builders had adapted the designs to withstand winter storms, reinforcing the walls with thick timbers from nearby forests. The result was an architecture that blended foreign elegance with pragmatic sturdiness. Teams of carpenters sawed and hammered under the watchful eyes of foremen, while donkey-drawn carts trundled past, laden with raw materials. Beyond the warehouses, the outline of a dry dock gleamed where Myrish engineers worked alongside Northmen to build the next generation of trading galleys. Jon felt a stir of pride. None of this would have been possible 10 or 15 years ago, when the North had languished in the aftermath of one war after another. How quickly the world could change when people set aside their blades in favor of shared prosperity. His presence in White Harbor was more than a casual inspection. He had business to attend to within the high tower of the Manderless, an audience with some of the key stakeholders who managed the White Harbor Concord. The Concord, as it was now called in both Westeros and Essos, had grown from a piece of parchment into an institution. Representatives from each signatory city or kingdom kept offices in White Harbor, forming what they referred to as the Council of the Concord. Twice a year, the council met to discuss mutual defense, trade regulation, and the various crises or opportunities that arose across the lands. The council had no single ruler, but most everyone recognized that Jon Snow, along with Sansa Stark in Winterfell, and a few key figures from Essos, held the most influence. The arrangement required constant negotiation, endless talks, and a delicate balance of interests, but so far it had kept the peace. When Jon reached the High Tower's council chamber, he paused outside the thick oak doors. He could hear raised voices within. Ghost, padding at his side, pricked his ears. The direwolf sensed tension and let out a low, rumbling growl. But Jon placed a calming hand on Ghost's back. A pair of northern guards in mail nodded solemnly to Jon, opened the doors, and announced him. The conversation inside died instantly. Envoys, magisters, and bankers turned to regard him. Around a large oval table they sat, quills and parchment scattered among pitchers of watered wine. The windows behind them framed a sweeping view of the harbor, where gulls swooped and ships rolled on the tide. The air felt heavy with argument. "Lord Snow," said Ciro Noller, one of Braavos' chief representatives, inclining his head in a show of respect. Over the years, Ciro had become an unexpectedly cooperative figure, though he was never afraid to spar with Jon in a war of words. "We were just discussing an urgent matter, the blockade at the Stepstones." Jon frowned. He took a seat at the table, Ghost lying down at his feet. "Blockade?" he echoed. A woman in Pentoshi silks, Magister Arothi, leaned forward. "A group of pirates, or so they claim to be, has seized control of strategic points in the Stepstones. They're attacking any ship that doesn't pay a toll. Reports suggest they have ties to mercenary captains out of Tyrosh, maybe even the Golden Company remnants." "They see." Jon's jaw tightened. The Stepstones were a chain of islands between Dorne and Essos, notorious for pirates. But of late, the shipping lanes through that region had become essential to trade between the Concord signatories. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "Over a moon's turn," Ciro said. "We thought it a mere nuisance at first. Now we learn they've attacked 5 ships flying Braavosi or Pentoshi flags, demanded ransoms for their cargo. The Myrish envoy says at least one vessel was lost entirely, its crew killed or sold who knows where." "Nabemo." Jon caught the flicker of anger in Magister Urthia's eyes. She was young for a Pentoshi official, but had grown influential due to her skill in negotiation. "The Concord promised joint protection against piracy," she reminded Jon. "It did," Jon agreed. And that promise stands. We'll convene a special commission to handle this threat. Davos Seaworth spoke up from the far end of the table. He had aged, his beard shot through with silver, but his eyes remained sharp with intelligence. He served as Jon's closest counselor in maritime affairs. Begging everyone's pardon, he said, but we can't simply sail a fleet down there without preparation. If these raiders are coordinated, they might have more resources than we suspect. We'll need a combined force from Braavos, Pentos Mir, and the North to handle them. Volunteers from Laius too if they'll join us. The Triarchs of Volantis might provide muscle if promised certain trade incentives. But it'll take time to gather so many ships, and time to plan an offensive. Meanwhile, the pirates will keep harassing merchant vessels. Essos. Jon nodded. Then let's work swiftly to form that combined force. We'll send out ravens today, along with dispatches to each city. I'll see to it the North contributes warships from White Harbor's new flotilla. Braavos should do the same. We'll coordinate with Pentos and Mir. The Licini might hesitate, but perhaps they can be convinced to supply a few ships, or at least open their ports for resupply. Ciro Noalar gave a thin smile. That's exactly what we were debating. Some among us believe it's best to pay these pirates a bribe to leave our ships alone, at least until we can address the threat properly. The Iron Bank, of course, would prefer to handle such matters more quietly. Then Jon studied him. And what do you think? I think paying them sets a bad precedent. But we can't ignore the cost of losing more vessels. Braavos is losing money daily while trade is disrupted. Jon exhaled slowly. He knew only too well how swiftly a crisis like this could spiral. I agree that paying them is a terrible precedent, he said. It'll only encourage more groups to do the same. The Concord stands for shared defense. If we yield once, we'll face a dozen new threats tomorrow. He turned to Davos. Start gathering names of captains. We'll form a plan to sail south as soon as possible. Braavos can muster some war galleys. Pentos has a small fleet. We have enough to at least challenge these pirates. Magister Arothe tapped her quill against the table. I'll write to Kovaro. He still holds influence in Pentos, though we've had political upheaval recently. She shot Ciro a look of wry amusement. I'm sure Braavos hears about it daily. Ciro coughed lightly. Kovaro may be out of favor with some Pentoshi factions, but his money is still good. We can figure that part out. Jon nodded. Let's proceed. We cannot allow these pirates to disrupt our unity. He swept his gaze around the table. The Concord thrives on stability. If it fails to protect trade, we risk unraveling all we've worked to build. They spent the next hours drafting letters, sealing them with wax bearing the direwolf, or the Braavosi seal, or the Pentoshi sigil, and dispatching them by raven. Jon listened carefully to each envoy's concerns, balancing them as best he could. Magister Arothe insisted that Pentos deserved a greater share of spoils from the pirates, if their ships comprised the bulk of the fleet. The Mirish delegate bristled at that, retorting that Mir had lost vessels too, and therefore had equal claim. Ciro tried to moderate. Davos reminded them that the North's primary goal was simply to restore safe passage. Jon let them argue, quietly ensuring that no one party dominated. When, at last, a workable plan emerged, the delegates adjourned, satisfied for the moment. After the meeting, Jon lingered. Ciro approached him, black robes drifting across the stone floor. I sometimes wonder, he said in a subdued voice, if the Concord isn't growing too fast. So many factions, so many interests, one crisis after another. Jon sighed. Unity is always tested by adversity. We can't expect smooth sailing. A faint spark lit Ciro's gaze. True enough. Yet you handle it with a steady hand. Perhaps it's your northern stoicism. Jon offered a small, tired smile. And your Braavosi pragmatism helps keep the coin flowing. We make a fine pair. Ciro bowed lightly and departed. Jon turned to find Davos waiting. The old smuggler studied him with a thoughtful expression. You're working yourself ragged, Jon, he said quietly. All these crises, day in and day out. Might be wise to take a moment for yourself. Jon shook his head. Too much at stake. I can rest when we have a stable realm. The pirates at the Stepstones are just another challenge. One day, it might be an uprising in Lis, or a coup in Pentos, or an iron-born incursion on our western coasts. We can't afford complacency. Me? You're not complacent, Davos said, laying a hand on Joan's shoulder. You're relentless, and that's good. But unrelenting effort carries its own dangers. Don't forget that you're only human. John gave him a rueful glance. You're not the first to warn me of that, Davos. With a gentle pat, Davos left him to gather his thoughts in the quiet of the council chamber. Ghost rose and stretched, yawning with jaws full of sharp teeth, then pressed his muzzle against Joan's side. John ruffled the direwolf's fur. The tension in the room had bled away, leaving behind only the faint echo of voices. If John closed his eyes, he could almost imagine the swirl of a winter wind or the hush of the godswood in Winterfell. Instead, he heard gulls crying outside and the churning of the harbor waters. The north was changing, yes, but so was he. In forging a path between two continents, he had lost the simple illusions of a straightforward life. He moved now in a realm of endless negotiations, where the fragile unity he guarded could unravel at any moment. He left the high tower and made his way to the fortifications overlooking the harbor. There, he found Tormund Giantsbane, leaning against the parapet. Despite the passing years, Tormund remained a powerful presence, his red beard grown longer and streaked with a few white hairs, his frame still robust. He wore northern leathers, more comfortable in White Harbor's climate than the heavier furs of the far north, but he retained his wild sense of humor and defiance. He cast a sideways grin at John as he heard footsteps approach. "Did they talk your ears off about the pirates?" Tormund asked, drumming thick fingers on the stone. John nodded. "They did. We're assembling a fleet to deal with them." Tormund spat over the edge, watching the spittle vanish into the depths below. "I've got 2 longships of free folk sailors ready to fight, if you need them. Not that these soft city dwellers will appreciate our help." John suppressed a smile. "We're past the days of suspicion, I'd like to think. Most lords in the north, and many in the free cities, know the free folk's worth." "Bah," Tormund grunted, though his eyes gleamed with a sort of rugged pride. "Maybe so. We'll smash these pirates if they cross us. That's what matters." John recalled the countless battles he and Tormund had faced together, from the haunted nights at the wall to the war against the dead. He placed a hand on Tormund's shoulder, feeling the solid mass of muscle beneath. "We'll call on you if the threat becomes dire. Right now, it's a matter for the Concord's combined fleet." "Then?" Tormund gave him a conspiratorial wink. "Hey, well, don't forget that sometimes a swift blow is worth 10 councils of chatter. You spend a lot of time behind closed doors with men who love to talk." John let out a soft exhale. "Sometimes I wish I could solve problems with a single strike of Longclaw, but these are different times." Different. I suppose that's a victory on its own." Tormund's gaze flicked to a distant ship rounding the headland. "Still, if you ever need the free folk, we're here. My people like being free in the north, but we haven't lost our taste for a good scrap when it's just." "Nestum." John thanked him, then gazed out at the horizon. The day was fading, the sun dipping behind the western hills, sending rays of gold across the harbor. He felt a tug of melancholy. This city, once a northern stronghold overshadowed by Winterfell, was now an essential hub for half the known world. He wondered if Ned Stark could have imagined such a future. Perhaps not. But the new roads were built upon the hopes and sacrifices of many, including Ned himself. In the following days, dispatches were sent and replies arrived. Braavos agreed to contribute 10 war galleys, each commanded by a seasoned captain. Pentos promised 5, plus a supply ship. Myr could only spare 3, but they pledged top-notch alchemists aboard them, armed with green-hued concoctions rumored to burn on water. Lys, as expected, hesitated. Half the city was embroiled in a local power struggle, but a few Lyseni merchant houses volunteered privateer vessels. Valentis was slow to respond, the Triarchs enmeshed in internal disputes over slavery regulations. Still, it was better than nothing. White Harbor itself had a growing navy, fashioned in part by Myrish engineers, So John commissioned 6 war galleys under Davos' overall leadership. Over the course of a month, these ships converged along the coast near White Harbor, anchoring in the bay and filling the town with sailors from a half-dozen cultures. Torment's free folk stood out among them, wearing furs even in the mild weather, armed with crude-looking axes and short bows. Braavosi captains eyed them with guarded respect, recalling tales of how the free folk had survived beyond the wall. Pentoshi magisters fussed over their ledgers, ensuring they would be compensated in loot or ransom from the pirates once the battle was done. Through it all, John and Davos coordinated, ensuring no single faction overshadowed the others. They drew up a route to sail south, heading past the Vale's coastline. Those waters were nominally open, though the Vale's lords had grown wary of the North's ascendancy. Each day was a delicate dance of negotiations, supply management, and mustering sailors who could put aside their cultural differences long enough to follow a single command. At last, on a brisk morning flecked with clouds, the fleet hoisted sails and began its journey. John stood on the deck of the Winter's Promise, the flagship of the Northern Flotilla, a sleek war galley with dark gray sails marked by the direwolf in white. Davos captained the vessel, while John rode as an observer and overall commander. Ghost stayed at his side, unnerving some of the sailors, but the direwolf had proven adept at sniffing out contraband or stowaways. Aboard the neighboring Braavosi galley, Ciro Noeller had taken a post, though he was more a diplomat than a warrior. Magister Arothe traveled on a Pentoshi vessel, wearing practical clothing rather than her usual silks, determined to see firsthand that Penta's ships were used effectively. Behind them, Marish galleys sailed in a tight formation, their prows adorned with carved figures meant to ward off evil. The combined banner of the Concord flew at the top of each mast, a temporary symbol featuring stylized waves and a star, a sign of unity at sea. For days, they navigated the waters along the eastern coast of Westeros. The weather was merciful, with only light rains and moderate winds. Whenever they passed a coastal village, curious eyes watched the procession of ships. Some folks cheered, having heard rumors that the North had rallied allies from beyond the sea. Others gazed in silent awe at the strange array of flags. The fleet avoided docking except for brief stops to replenish fresh water and supplies, preferring to maintain momentum. Each night, they anchored in a sheltered cove, or continued carefully by starlight. John found himself often standing at the bow, listening to the creak of timbers and the soft hiss of the sea. He thought of the old days at Castle Black, the howling winds that battered the wall, the stark emptiness of the far north. Here, though, the ocean was alive with life and possibility, even under the threat of pirates. When they reached the waters off the Vale, a handful of knights patrolling the coastline rode along the cliffs, watching from a distance. John wondered whether Lord Royce or any of the Vale lords would attempt to hinder them, but no such challenge came. News of the Stepstones blockade had likely reached them, and the Vale had no interest in being seen as obstructing a joint anti-piracy effort. So the fleet sailed on unimpeded. By the time they rounded Crackclaw Point, they turned southeast, heading toward the open sea. Clouds gathered in the distance, hinting at a possible storm, but Davos charted a course that kept them in calmer waters for the time being. One morning, a sleek Braavosi scout ship returned from a forward patrol with unsettling news. They had sighted a cluster of pirate vessels near the northern approach to the Stepstones, at least a dozen, armed and bearing black or red sails with no consistent sigil. Word was that these pirates extorted gold from Taroshi merchants, occasionally demanded passengers in place of coin, and had begun attacking Lyseni vessels that refused to pay tribute. They seemed well organized, too disciplined to be mere ragtag outlaws. Some carried sellsword crossbowmen, others rumored to have Myrish fire tubes, or even relics from the old Valyrian freehold, a troubling sign of support from unknown backers. John and Davos conferred on the deck of the Winter's Promise. Ciro and Magister Arothe joined them, as well as the lead Myrish captain, a gruff man named Sarax, who wore tinted goggles to protect his eyes from the glare of the sea. The decision was made to split the fleet into 2 groups, one circling around to approach the pirates from behind, while the main force advanced head-on. If the pirates scattered, they would be driven toward the second group, hopefully preventing an escape. They would attempt to offer terms, surrender, or face destruction. But no one expected the pirates to surrender willingly. The next day dawned gray and misty, the sea cloaked in a veil of low clouds. The wind blew in from the south, bringing the smell of brine and dampness. Visibility was poor. John stood near the prow, scanning the horizon, trying to discern shapes through the shifting gloom. All around them, the other ships emerged like ghosts, sails shrouded. Davos ordered a slow advance, cautioning that the pirates might lie in wait. The deck thrummed underfoot as archers readied their bows, pikes were distributed, and the tension rose like a held breath. Suddenly a cry went up from the lookout perched high in the rigging. Shapes sighted to the southeast. Through the haze, faint silhouettes appeared, longships and galleys, some with tattered sails, others bearing crude emblems. The pirates had spotted them as well, for a horn blast echoed across the water, followed by the rush of oars. The Stepstones, rocky and treacherous, loomed behind them like the broken teeth of a giant. Joan's heart pounded. Though he had led men into countless battles, the swirl of sea-borne combat was always a crucible of confusion. He signaled Davos to proceed. The winter's promise held course, with Braavosi war galleys fanning out on either side. Pentoshi ships formed a second line, and the Mirish galleys, loaded with alchemical weapons, hung back slightly, ready to unleash their deadly concoctions if needed. The pirates, seeing the formidable fleet, shifted formation as though uncertain whether to flee or fight. Then from among them one large galley, its sail painted with a snarling tiger's head, charged forward, no doubt a show of defiance. A voice boomed through a speaking trumpet on one of the Braavosi ships, demanding the pirates stand down in the name of the White Harbor Concord. The only reply was a cacophony of drums and a hail of arrows that clattered against the Braavosi hulls. No turning back now. With practiced efficiency, Davos signaled for a general attack. The Braavosi vessels, built for speed, surged ahead to engage. Pentoshi archers loosed volleys over the water. The Mirish ships waited for an opening. John felt the winter's promise surge beneath him. Sailors manned the oars in synchronized strokes, carrying them into the heart of the fray. Pirates tried to flank them, oars churning the water. The ring of steel on steel soon filled the air as grappling hooks were thrown, dragging ships close for boarding. John watched from his vantage, calling out orders to archers. Ghost growled beside him, hackles raised, as if sensing the coming violence. One pirate longship tried to ram them, but Davos angled their hull, causing the attack to glance off. Northern archers picked off the pirates on the prow. A second pirate craft latched onto the winter's promise with grapnels, desperate to board. John, brandishing Longclaw, led a swift counter. Free folk warriors among the crew roared in savage delight as they hacked at ropes and cut down the first wave of pirates who leapt onto the deck. The stench of sweat, salt, and blood thickened. John parried a thrust from a pirate's curved blade, then slammed the pommel of his sword into the attacker's jaw. He spun to deflect another blow, adrenaline coursing through him. Memories of Hardhome, the Battle of the Bastards, the long night flickered in his mind, a reminder that he was forged by wars more terrible than this. Even so, each clash felt perilous. The deck slickened with spray and blood. Shouts in a dozen accents merged into a chaotic roar. From the corner of his eye, John saw Tormund, who had insisted on joining the expedition, bellowing as he swung an axe, the blade biting deep into a pirate's shoulder. Davos, older but still agile, moved behind a shield, rallying the men with curt instructions. A volley of flaming arrows from a Braavosi ship arced overhead. Some landed in the pirate vessel, setting its sails aflame. Panic screams rose as the pirates tried to douse the fire. Meanwhile, the Mirish galleys unleashed their secret weapons on another cluster of pirate ships. Jets of greenish flame spurted across the water, igniting hulls that burned with unnatural ferocity. Even in the swirl of combat, John felt a pang of disquiet at the savage power of alchemy. But to break the pirates' blockade, they needed every advantage. One by one, the pirate vessels faltered, battered by the combined might of the Concord. A few tried to flee into the labyrinth of rocks that composed the Stepstones, hoping to lose pursuers among hidden coves. But the second group of Allied ships, led by a cunning Braavosi captain, lay in wait. The fleeing pirates found themselves trapped. Those who attempted a last stand were overrun. Others cast their weapons aside and pleaded for mercy, which was granted, though their leaders were swiftly bound. Some pirate crews refused to surrender, fighting to the last. Hours later, the battle subsided, leaving the sea strewn with debris and a few sinking hulls. The air smelled of smoke and charred wood, the tang of spilled blood. Gulls circled overhead, drawn by the carnage. John stood on the deck, chest heaving, surveying the aftermath. His cloak was torn, smeared with grime, and Ghost's white fur was spattered with crimson. But they had achieved victory. Of the pirate fleet, only a handful of vessels escaped into the open sea, their black sails receding into the distance. The rest lay captured or burning, testament to the Concord's might. Davos and Tormund approached. Tormund's beard was singed on one side. "Damned fire from the Mirish nearly cooked me," he grumbled, though his eyes gleamed with fierce satisfaction. "We gave them a taste of what real warriors can do." Davos wiped sweat from his brow. "We'll need to search the wrecks, gather survivors, see who was in charge of this blockade. I suspect we'll find evidence of sponsors." "Neither may." John nodded grimly. "Let's do it. Have the Braavosi and Pentoshi question any captains we've taken alive. Find out who funded them, who encouraged them to block our ships." He paused, glancing at the swirling gray waters. Bodies bobbed amidst the floating timbers. "We'll keep searching. There may be hidden coves with more pirates. This must be thorough. The Stepstones must be cleared." They spent days combing the Stepstones. The rocky islets teemed with craggy inlets and smugglers' caches. Several small pirate camps were discovered, their inhabitants surrendering quickly once they saw the might arrayed against them. In one such hideout, Mirish soldiers unearthed crates of crossbows, bearing markings that suggested Tyrosh as their origin. Another group found letters referencing a Lord Clifton from the Westerlands, perhaps the same name linked to the earlier raids along the North's western coast. The labyrinthine politics of Westeros and Essos reared its head anew. Clearly, some powerful figures still hoped to undermine or profit from the Concord's downfall. Despite the heavy labor and the lingering stench of death, the Allied fleet completed its mission. Merchant shipping lanes reopened, escorted by the war galleys for safety. The pirates who survived faced execution or, in some cases, imprisonment pending a trial under the Concord's newly established maritime laws. The success of the operation resonated across both continents. Word reached Braavos, Pentos, and Myr that the White Harbor Concord stood firm in defending its own. The Triarchs of Volantis, belatedly sending a small detachment, were impressed by the efficiency of the Concord's response. Even Lys, beset by internal strife, found it prudent to commend the victory. For John, the victory brought a measure of relief, yet it also underscored how fragile their world remained. Any day, new plots could emerge. Pirates were only a symptom. Behind them lay unscrupulous lords and magisters who chafed at the Concord's growing unity. Some men thrived on chaos, profit to be found in war or disruption. To keep forging forward, John would have to stand resolute. In the weeks after the fleet's return to White Harbor, a sense of triumph settled upon the city. The sailors who survived reaped rewards and told grand tales of the battle at the Stepstones. Northern folk listened, astonished, as Myrish and Braavosi told stories of monstrous warships, flaming arrows, and cunning maneuvers. Tormund boasted loudly in alehouses, describing how he and Ghost tore through a dozen pirates. Children ran about playing at Pirates versus Concord, brandishing wooden swords. For a moment, camaraderie and shared pride bridged cultural gaps. Amid the revelry, John quietly resumed his duties. Letters arrived daily, each with its own demands. The Triarchs of Volantis congratulated him on the victory, but insisted once again on certain leeways for their concept of indentured labor. Braavosi bankers requested an audience to discuss expansions of the harbor and new loan terms. The Lyseni envoy urged John to intervene in a local power dispute in Lys. The Vale remained aloof, though rumors suggested some Vale lords might be interested in partial membership if certain trade concessions were offered. The Crownlands, guided by Tyrion's counsel, sent a measured note of approval, but no direct commitment to fully join the Concord. Through it all, Sansa wrote from Winterfell, updating Jon on the North's internal affairs, harvest yields, border disputes with the Iron Islands, expansion of roads to connect more villages. She also cautioned him that old grudges might resurface if progress felt too swift or too foreign. One morning, as Jon pored over a stack of missives in the High Tower's study, Arya Stark materialized in the doorway like a wisp of smoke. She had been away on one of her silent journeys, traveling unknown roads, slipping into corners of Essos or Westeros where few could follow. She looked lean and sharp, her eyes keen with knowledge she carried like a hidden blade. Without preamble, she moved to Jon's side, scanning the letters he had spread across the desk. Ghost, sensing her presence, rose and approached with a gentle wag of his tail. "You've been busy," Arya said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "And so have I. There's something you need to know." Jon set down his quill. "What have you found?" She placed a small scroll on the table, tied with a simple cord. "I copied the contents from a message I intercepted in Braavos. It's in code, but I recognize some references to known conspirators, factions within Braavos and Tyrosh, possibly financed by certain Westerosi lords." Jon felt a knot tighten in his chest. "Did you discover who in Westeros might be involved?" Arya shook her head. "They hid their names. But I suspect it's more than just Lord Clifton. There's talk of distributing large sums of coin to certain Lyseni houses, fueling their civil strife. If Lys erupts in full-blown conflict, it could draw Myr in, and then Pentos, all while Braavos tries to salvage the situation. The North would be torn between alliances, forced to choose sides. If we handle it poorly, the Concord unravels." "Nanigater." Jon took a slow breath, eyes flickering over the coded words. "This is exactly what I feared. The bigger we become, the more some will try to tear us apart." Arya's voice was level. "We can't let them succeed. We need to act, but carefully. If we march into Lys or Myr without invitation, we become invaders. If we stand aside, we let them foment chaos." He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "We need more proof, and we need the local powers to request Concord assistance, so we're not overstepping. Has Ciro seen this?" "Not yet. I came to you first. He's loyal to the Braavosi Sea Lord, but he also has his own alliances." She tapped the scroll. "We have to consider the possibility that someone in Braavos might be complicit, or at least complicit by silence." Jon rubbed a hand across his brow. "All right. We'll speak with Ciro together, but we won't reveal everything, just enough to prompt an investigation from Braavos. Then we'll alert Pentos and Myr's representatives quietly. Lys is the powder keg right now. If we can stabilize Lys before it ignites, we may thwart this conspiracy." Arya nodded. "I'll keep digging. These conspirators aren't invincible. They rely on secrecy. We bring their plans into the light, and they'll have to scramble." "Dandermenti." Jon thanked her, feeling a surge of gratitude that Arya's skills still served them so well. In truth, he worried about her, constantly wandering the hidden paths of the world. But he also knew she could not be confined. She was as much a free spirit as the wind. For her to remain still would be like caging a hawk. Over the next days, Jon discreetly met with Ciro Noeller, showing him only part of the intercepted message, enough to provoke concern but not enough to expose Arya's direct involvement. Ciro's eyes hardened as he read the lines referencing Braavosi figures. "I'll look into this," he said quietly. "If there is corruption in Braavos, I'll find it. But be warned, those who profit from sabotage are often well-connected. We'll have to tread carefully." Jon also conferred with Magister Orothi of Pentos and with the Myrish envoy, Captain Sarax, letting them know a plot might target Lys and Myr. Both expressed alarm, though Sarax laughed darkly at the prospect of conspirators, thinking Myr would be easily swayed. "They forget Myr has sharp claws," he said. "But yes, we'll keep our eyes open." Meanwhile, Letters were sent to the leading houses of Lys, urging them to remain calm and consider official membership in the Concord, which would entitle them to defense. The city had been flirting with partial membership for years, always undone by internal feuds among the pleasure houses and merchant families. Perhaps now was the moment to bring them fully into the fold, offering a shield against outside meddling. John doubted it would be simple. Lys prided itself on a tradition of decadent independence, and its various factions liked to play each other against outside powers for profit. But if the alternative was a city torn apart by an engineered civil war, the choice might be clearer to them. One afternoon, while John was submerged in these concerns, he received an unexpected visitor at the high tower. A young page announced that Tyrion Lannister had arrived from King's Landing, accompanied by a small retinue of Crown Lands guards. Surprised, John hurried to the courtyard, where he found Tyrion dismounting from a horse, dusting off his cloak and gazing about with evident interest. The guards behind him seemed ill at ease among so many northerners and foreigners. "Jon Snow," Tyrion called out, smiling as he glimpsed John. "I've heard that White Harbor never sleeps these days, and it seems I've arrived to witness that firsthand." John inclined his head. "Lord Hand, we weren't expecting you. Is King Bran well?" Tyrion nodded, stepping forward to clasp John's forearm in greeting. "As well as a king can be, presiding over a realm that never runs out of problems. He sends his regards and a message. May we speak in private?" John led Tyrion to a quieter chamber, not quite as formal as the main council room, but private enough for a conversation of importance. He offered the Lannister wine, which Tyrion accepted gratefully. The dwarf studied the walls, where tapestries depicted the direwolf of House Stark interwoven with nautical motifs, another subtle symbol of how the north and the sea had merged. After sipping the wine, Tyrion leaned back. "I'll be direct. King Bran grows concerned about the Concord. He sees its benefits, yes, but also senses that many lords in the south fear it may overshadow them. Some whisper that the north is forging a new empire, one that might one day claim the Iron Throne by default, if not by conquest." "Nenete." John frowned. "We've made no move against the south. We've invited them to join trade agreements. They've refused." "Indeed. But fear and envy aren't always rational. Lately, some lords in the Reach and the Westerlands have begun forging alliances to counterbalance the Concord's influence. They claim to do so in the name of preserving Westerosi sovereignty. The Crown, too, must tread carefully. If Bran openly favors the Concord, he risks alienating half the great houses." "Insane." John sighed heavily. He glanced at Tyrion. "So, is Bran considering siding against us?" Tyrion's eyes flickered with sympathy. "No, not yet. He remembers who you are, John, and what you did for the realm. But he needs assurances, some formal statement that the Concord doesn't seek to supplant the king's authority in Westeros, that you remain loyal to the realm's overarching stability. Otherwise, his position in King's Landing becomes precarious." "Inane." A pang struck Jon's heart. He knew how complicated politics in King's Landing could be, how fragile King Bran's coalition was. The southern lords, especially in the Westerlands and Stormlands, bristled at the memory of northern independence under Robb Stark, then later under Jon and Sansa died. Now, with the Concord bridging continents, fear of a northern-led empire ran rampant. "I'll gladly affirm we have no designs on the Iron Throne," Jon said. "Our priority is peace and prosperity, not conquest." Tyrion nodded, swirling the wine in his cup. "If you'll draft such a statement, something King Bran can show the Great Council, it might settle nerves, at least for a time. Of course, if the Concord keeps expanding, that fear will never fully vanish. Men see power and assume it must want to grow." Jon took a slow breath. "I'll compose a formal declaration and sign it, and Sansa will do the same. It'll say that the North and its allied Concord respect the sovereignty of the Crown and the Seven Kingdoms, and that we neither seek nor desire to claim the Iron Throne." "Never one." "That should help. Also, if you'd consider hosting a small delegation from King's Landing to observe how the Concord functions, it might ease suspicions, Let them see the day-to-day reality, not rumors. John offered a terse smile. They're welcome to see for themselves. But I doubt they'll understand half of what they witness. The Concord is more flexible than a typical monarchy. And it's built on trust and mutual benefit, not feudal hierarchy. That may unsettle them more. Tyrion chuckled dryly. Indeed, new systems always unsettle old powers, but any attempt is better than letting them stew in ignorance. I'll convey your willingness to King Bran. As they spoke further, Tyrion inquired about the victory at the Stepstones, praising the Concord's swift action. He also showed curiosity about the rumor of conspiracies aimed at destabilizing Lys. Jon shared only the broad outlines, mindful of not revealing Arya's role. Tyrion rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Strange times indeed. I wonder how many such conspiracies brew in the shadows, waiting to strike. All I can do is remain watchful, Jon replied, and rely on those I trust. Tyrion nodded, then set down his wine cup. One more matter. Bran wonders if you might come to King's Landing at some point. Appear before the Great Council. Let them address their concerns to you directly. It might do much to diffuse the rumor that you hide behind your alliances in the north. But I understand if your duties here prevent that. Jon considered it. Traveling to King's Landing would remove him from White Harbor, from the heart of the Concord's operations, at a delicate time. Yet bridging the divide between the north and the southern lords might be worth the risk. I'll think about it, he said. There's much to handle right now, especially with Lys on the brink. But if the situation allows, I'll make the journey. I owe Bran that much, at least. Tyrion seemed satisfied. Their conversation turned to smaller pleasantries, shared memories of the wars they had survived, the direwolf ghost sniffing curiously at Tyrion's boots. Jon noted how lines of weariness marked Tyrion's face, the weight of years spent advising a kingdom that never truly found lasting peace. They were both older, both shaped by burdens they never sought. When Tyrion finally excused himself to retire, Jon rose, clasping his hand. For a moment, he glimpsed a flicker of the man who had once visited Winterfell with King Robert, who had taught Jon that being labeled a bastard or a dwarf did not preclude one from having worth. How far they had come, and yet how tenuous everything remained. Late that night, Jon stood at White Harbor's docks, breathing in the chill air. Lanterns glowed, reflecting off the dark water. The silhouette of ships loomed, masts creaking. A hush fell over the bustling city, though taverns still hummed with subdued revelry. He felt the pulse of this place, a melding of North and Essos, an engine of trade and possibility. This was the legacy he had helped build, forging alliances from the ruin of war. Yet in his heart, he wondered if destiny might push him further, into the role of bridging the rest of Westeros as well, or perhaps standing firm as an alternative to the Iron Throne. He did not want that power, any more than he had wanted to be king in the north. But the shape of events seemed to conspire toward ever greater responsibilities for him. Ghost pressed against Jon's leg, a silent reassurance. Jon gazed at the moonlit sea and exhaled. If conspirators lurked, if southern lords fretted and Lys teetered on chaos, he would do what needed to be done. He had promised to protect this fragile realm, and he would. Duty weighed on him like a well-worn cloak. He recalled Maester Aemon's words from years ago. Love is the death of duty. Perhaps that had been true once, for Targaryens who let passion lead them astray. But for Jon, duty had always come from love. The love of his family, his friends, the people he strove to shield. He did not see them as in conflict. Rather, they formed the guiding principle of his life. He would serve until his strength gave out, if that was what it took. In the days that followed, he worked tirelessly alongside Sero, Arothe, Davos, and others to preempt the brewing trouble in Lys. The Lyseni envoy, Lady Exi, who had once signed the original White Harbor Concord, sent frantic messages describing unrest among the city's wealthiest houses. Street fights erupted, with masked men targeting specific courtesans and merchants. Rumors suggested an influx of coin from outside powers, paying bravos to fan the flames. Agents of the Concord in Lys reported that the ruling council was on the verge of fragmenting, with each faction accusing another of selling out to foreign interests. When the city's fighting threatened the foreign enclaves, a crucial link for trade, Lady XA and several major Lysani merchant houses formally requested Concord's support to keep the peace. This gave John the opening he needed to act without appearing as an aggressor. A small contingent of Bravosi and Pentoshi guards, backed by volunteer soldiers from the north, sailed to Lys. Their official mission: to protect the Concord citizens and holdings, and to enforce a ceasefire at the request of Lysani authorities. It was a delicate matter. Even with an invitation, half the city might resent the presence of foreign troops. Yet, it was preferable to letting the city collapse into bloodshed that would inevitably spill onto the sea lanes. Meanwhile, Arya continued her investigations, slipping through the labyrinthine corridors of Lys pleasure palaces, listening at the fringes of lavish banquets. She uncovered deeper layers of intrigue. Some of the courtesans themselves, famed for their subtlety, had been bribed or coerced into luring powerful patrons into compromising situations. Blackmail soared, fueling more chaos. She found coded letters referencing the same conspirators who had funded the pirates and the Stepstones. Tyrion arrived in Lys not long after, in an official capacity on behalf of King Bran, to observe how the Concord handled the crisis. He offered what counsel he could, though he had no official authority over the Concord forces. The situation teetered on the brink of all-out war. In the narrow streets of Lys, where flowers dripped from balconies and perfumed scents drifted from the pleasure houses, deadly skirmishes broke out at night. Bodies turned up in the canals, throats slit. The Lyseni Watch had collapsed under the pressure, with certain captains allying themselves to different merchant factions. Through it all, the Concord guards tried to remain impartial, focusing on protecting foreign enclaves, ensuring no single faction destroyed the city's infrastructure, and pleading with local leaders to come to the negotiating table. John himself arrived in Lys aboard a swift Bravosi galley. This time, Sansa remained in Winterfell, overseeing the north in his absence. The moment John set foot on Lys' white sand beaches, the humid air made him aware he was a long way from home. The city's architecture was a riot of pastel hues, lavish villas, and ornate spires, all now overshadowed by a sense of looming danger. Ghost bounded beside him, drawing startled looks from Lyseni guards who had rarely, if ever, seen a direwolf. Arothe, who had arrived earlier, greeted John with a tight-lipped expression. "They've agreed to a summit in the Hall of Blossoms," she explained, referring to one of the city's most famous structures, a grand rotunda used for public ceremonies. But each faction insists on bringing their own armed retinue. "We'll have swords aplenty in one place." "Nepsimtor." John frowned. "A single spark, and it becomes a massacre." "Exactly. But if we don't gather them, the city remains in chaos. We need them at least talking." Tyrion, appearing at Arathe's side, splayed his hands. "I'm quite good at talking, but this city is an ever-shifting mosaic of alliances. Half of them hate each other for reasons stretching back decades. The other half are being paid by outside forces we can't fully identify. Good luck." John thanked them both, then proceeded to the quarters set aside for the Concord delegation. Lysane's artistry was evident even in the midst of turmoil. Mosaics adorned every corridor, depicting scenes of myth and carnal pleasure, an unsettling reminder of the city's reputation. He passed Concord soldiers standing guard, a mix of northern men wearing direwolf insignias and Bravosi in black and silver. They stiffened to attention when John approached. Inside, he found Arya waiting, clad in light leathers suitable for the Lyseni climate, her face impassive. She handed John another small scrap of parchment, the edges frayed. "More evidence," she said. "Mentions a Kraken Lord sponsor funneling gold to certain Lyseni houses, along with a coded name that might be a Westerosi connection. This runs deep, John." John's mouth set into a firm line. "We'll do everything we can to expose it." That evening, the delegates of Lys' major factions gathered in the Hall of Blossoms, a circular space with soaring pillars carved into the likeness of entwined lovers. The dome overhead showcased a fresco of pastel flowers and lissome figures, once meant to celebrate the city's sensual beauty. Now, it loomed over a cluster of suspicious armed men and women. Each faction had staked out a segment of the floor, glowering at the others. Concord guards were posted around the perimeter, along with local watch who were theoretically neutral. John stood at the center with Magister Orothii, Tyrion, and a Braavosi mediator named Pellereau. One by one, the Lyseni leaders aired their grievances. House Narain accused House Yarato of conspiring with foreign agents. House Yarato retorted that Narain was subservient to Braavos. Another house, Vorondel, insisted that the Concord meddled in Laius' sovereignty. Tempers flared, voices rose, and hands drifted toward sword hilts. Through it all, John and Pellereau tried to steer the conversation, asking each faction to present concrete demands rather than hurl accusations. The air was stifling, scented with incense that did little to mask the tension. Then a masked figure, presumably belonging to House Vorondel's retinue, broke the fragile equilibrium. He shouted that the entire council was a sham, that Lys should rid itself of foreign dogs. Before the man could say more, he whipped out a short crossbow. Gasps sounded. The man fired a quarrel aimed directly at John. Reflex took over. John lurched aside, the bolt whistling past him to embed in the floor. In an instant, chaos erupted. Concord guards rushed forward. Lyseni swords flashed. Screams and oaths echoed off the dome. Tormund, who had insisted on accompanying John, roared a challenge and flung himself toward the assailant. Ghost bounded after him, snarling. The masked man tried to reload his crossbow, but never got the chance. Tormund's fist connected with a sickening crunch, sending the attacker sprawling. Simultaneously, some members of House Irato's retinue drew blades and advanced on House Narain, perhaps seeing an opportunity to settle old scores. Pandemonium reigned. John shouted for calm. Tyrion ducked behind a pillar, cursing. Arya emerged from the shadows, disarming a swordsman who rushed at Jon's flank, her movements precise and lethal. Concord guards encircled John, forming a barrier against further attacks. Meanwhile, the Braavosi mediator Pellereau tried vainly to restore order, only to be shoved aside by feuding Lyseni. Blood quickly slicked the marble floor as armed men clashed. John was no stranger to a battle's frenzy. But this was different, an indoor riot, fueled by paranoia and suspicion. He parried a blow from a wild-eyed Lyseni who wore the crest of House Narain, then disarmed him with a slash that sent the sword spinning. Another attacker lunged from behind, and John twisted aside, letting Ghost leap at the man's throat. A wave of local watchmen poured in, uncertain who they were meant to subdue. Tyrion, seeing no immediate threat near him, scrambled out to help Pellereau, dragging the mediator to relative safety. Moments stretched like hours in the swirl of confusion. Tormund's furious bellows provided a rallying point for the Concord guards, who systematically forced the brawling Lyseni apart. Arya struck with graceful precision, subduing multiple fighters without killing them, if possible. John stepped forward, bellowing at the top of his lungs for everyone to stand down. Gradually, the Concord soldiers gained the upper hand. Swords were knocked aside, men shoved to the ground, crossbows kicked away. Those who refused to yield were taken down by brute force. When at last the chaos subsided, the Hall of Blossoms was a wreck. Splashes of blood marred the marble floor, and the sweet incense had turned cloying, mingling with the odor of sweat and fear. Dozens of Lyseni delegates had fled. Others lay groaning, wounded or unconscious. The masked assailant who shot at John was pinned under Tormund's knee, half-conscious, his mask torn off to reveal a gaunt man with haunted eyes, no one John recognized. House Vorondel's representative shrank back in horror, claiming no knowledge of the attacker's identity. John wiped sweat from his brow, breathing hard. This was precisely the outcome he had hoped to avoid. Tyrion joined him, face pale. "So much for negotiation," Tyrion said, voice trembling with frustrated anger. "They played right into the conspirators' hands. Now, half the city will say the Concord used violence to impose order." John looked around, seeing the frightened faces of Lyseni survivors. "We had no choice," he said, though the words felt hollow. "They fired first." Arya knelt by the pinned assailant, searching him. She found a small token sewn into his collar, a stylized kraken. She held it up, meeting John's gaze grimly. "The Iron Islands, or someone who wants us to think so." John nodded, feeling a swirl of dismay. The webs of conspiracy tangled further. He raised his voice, addressing the battered remnants of the Liceni delegation. "Look at the blood spilled today," he said, gesturing around them. "This is what comes of mistrust and hidden agendas. The Concord came here by your invitation to prevent bloodshed, not cause it. Someone wants Lys to tear itself apart. We must stand against that, together." A hush fell, broken only by pained groans. Some of the Liceni looked ashamed, others simply cautious. House Narain's leader, an older woman named Alanya, bowed her head. "I see that now, but the city is near breaking. How can we restore peace after this?" Tormund stood, shaking out his fist. "Surrender your damned swords and start talking like decent folk. That's how." John offered a gentler approach. "Set aside blame and come to the table again, properly guarded, with neutral witnesses. We'll investigate who funded these attackers. If you want Lys to remain free and prosperous, you have to help us root out the saboteurs." "Ben?" Slowly, painfully, House Narain, House Harado, and the other factions present gave their reluctant agreement. The immediate violence had left them sobered, no longer eager to brandish blades. Tyrion signaled for the local watch to escort the wounded to healers, while Concord guards disarmed the survivors. The masked assailant, unconscious now, would be handed over for interrogation. The Hall of Blossoms, once a symbol of Lea's sensual decadence, had become a battlefield. In the following days, the city hovered between relief and resentment. Some Liceni welcomed the Concord's intervention, especially those who recognized how close they had come to full-scale civil war. Others grumbled that foreign soldiers now patrolled their streets. John oversaw the creation of a temporary council, composed of delegates from each major Liceni house, supervised by Concord mediators. Their mandate was to restore order, track down any conspirators or hidden bravos, and eventually draft a treaty that might see Lys join the Concord fully. Despite the complications, they made cautious progress. The masked assailant's interrogation, conducted by Braavosi intelligence agents, revealed partial admissions that money had come from an unknown sponsor using a Kraken symbol. He claimed to have never met the sponsor in person, only a Taroshi intermediary. Arya cross-checked this with her own sources, confirming a shadow network that seemed to connect certain Ironborn with disgruntled Westerosi lords and Tyroshi mercenaries. The evidence pointed to a deliberate campaign to undermine the Concord in key cities, sowing chaos and eroding confidence. In reaction, John dispatched warnings to Myr, Pentos, and Braavos, urging heightened vigilance. He wrote to Sansa, summarizing the turmoil in Lys and the likely involvement of unscrupulous forces from Westeros. A gnawing worry tugged at him. If the conspirators were so bold in Lys, they might strike elsewhere, perhaps in the north or White Harbor itself. The notion that House Greyjoy or allied Ironborn might be implicated only added to the tension, recalling the old days when the Iron Islands raided the coasts with impunity. Meanwhile, Tyrion composed a cautious missive to King Bran, explaining the events in Lys and praising Jon's efforts to keep a lid on the city's chaos. Perhaps now the Southern Lords will see the Concord as a stabilizing force, Tyrion mused. Those cynics might twist it into proof that you're meddling in free cities for your own gain. Jon sighed. I can't control their perceptions. I can only act to prevent more bloodshed. You do it well, Jon Snow. Better than most kings I've known. Jon's lips twitched at the irony. He had never wanted to be a king, nor did he want an empire. Yet he found himself standing at the center of power that spanned oceans. It was a responsibility he could not forsake, for the sake of all those who believed in the promise of a better world. Once the immediate crisis in Lys began to subside, factions turning to the negotiation table rather than to knives, Jon and Tyrion prepared to leave. Arya chose to stay behind a while longer, working in the shadows to identify any remaining conspirators. The city would remain under watch by Concord guards for a season, long enough to stabilize the situation. The Liceni Council, chastened by the outbreak of violence, made tentative moves toward a treaty with the Concord. They saw the advantage of guaranteed maritime protection, of direct access to northern resources, Myrish craftsmanship, Pentoshi finance, and Bravosi shipping. If the city of Lace truly joined, it would be another step toward a vast alliance bridging seas and kingdoms. Returning to White Harbor, John found himself bracing for the next storm. Sansa's letters mentioned rising tension in the western coasts of the north again, with hints that the Iron Islands might be behind fresh raids. She suspected that certain lords in the Westerlands encouraged such acts, hoping to bleed the north. The Crownlands, under King Bran, tried to broker a resolution, but the Ironborn remained elusive. Letters from Bravos and Pentos confirmed they'd heard rumors of the same conspirators, stirring trouble. While the Concord remained strong in principle, it was under near constant threat by those who found profit or power in sabotage. Even so, White Harbor thrived. Buildings rose, more merchants flowed through, and the sight of diverse peoples mingling in the streets had become normal. The children of the North spoke fragments of Bravosi and Pentoshi phrases, while sailors from Mer bartered for furs in the local markets. The city had become a symbol that cultures could coexist, forging prosperity rather than conflict. John took heart in that, even as he steeled himself against the perpetual challenges of a realm uniting East and West, without conquest or subjugation. On a crisp afternoon he walked along the new breakwater that jutted from White Harbor's main quay. Here, the sea crashed against the stones, sending up white foam. The smell of salt and seaweed was strong. He gazed at the horizon, thinking of how countless ships traversed these waters now, each one a thread connecting distant lands. Ghost padded at his heel, sniffing at crabs scuttling in the rocks. In the distance, a group of free-folk children, splashed at the water's edge, watched over by a northern mother who had befriended their family. A living testament to the bridging of old divides. He felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw Sansa. She wore a practical dress in stark colors, her hair braided in a style reminiscent of their mother's. She had arrived in White Harbor the day before to confer with him directly, leaving Winterfell under the watch of trusted advisors. She came up beside him, gazing at the open sea. For a moment, neither spoke. The gulls cried overhead and the wind tugged at their cloaks. Then, Sansa placed a hand on his arm. "It never ceases to amaze me," she said softly, "how this place has changed. How the North has changed." John nodded. "And not just the North. We're woven into Essos now. We can't go back to being an isolated kingdom." Sansa's eyes flickered with a mix of pride and concern. "I know. And part of me wonders if this is the future Father would have wanted, for the North to stand strong but integrated into a wider world. He always thought honor was paramount, that alliances should be forged carefully. Maybe he'd approve. Now when John felt his throat constrict. He'd see we're trying to prevent the tragedies that haunted our family. Wars, betrayals, needless bloodshed. We do this so the next generations don't have to live in fear." Sansa leaned her head against his shoulder briefly. "We've come so far, yet I'm always wary. The letters from the West worry me. If the Ironborn are testing our coasts again, we can't ignore it." Joan's expression hardened. "We won't. The next step may be confronting the root cause, these conspirators, or even particular lords in the Westerlands. We have to show them that the Concord won't be broken by clandestine attacks. But that might lead to open conflict. Bran can't openly side with us if it means provoking half the realm into war." "Die." Sansa's voice was thoughtful. "Then we handle it with the same measured approach we've used all along. We gather proof, bring it before the Great Council if needed, or we strike back surgically at whoever is funding the Ironborn. We do not need to become tyrants to protect ourselves. The Concord is built on mutual defense, not conquest. We can't let fear turn us into what we hate." Memderwar. John squeezed her hand gently, grateful for her unwavering sense of resolve. If anything gave him hope, it was seeing how far Sansa had grown from the frightened girl in King's Landing to this formidable Lady of Winterfell, a partner in governance and survival. Together, they turned away from the breakwater, heading back toward the heart of White Harbor, where the newness of the day promised fresh challenges and fresh chances. Soon enough, messages arrived. The next council session for the Concord loomed, to be held once more in White Harbor. Delegates from Bravos, Pentos, Mir, and Lys, tentatively, would attend, along with observers from Volantis. A request also came from King Bran's court for a representative from the Crown lands, rumored to be Tyrion again, possibly accompanied by a few southern lords curious about forging official ties with the Concord. John prepared for the possibility that they might publicly address the threat of conspirators stirring trouble across Essos and the western north. If the evidence pointed clearly to Ironborn lords or certain Westerosi allies, it could be a defining moment, either a cause for unity or a spark for conflict. As the day of the council drew near, Sansa remained in White Harbor, determined to stand beside Jon and ensure the North's interests were well represented. Arya was en route from Lys, bringing her collected evidence on the conspirators. Tormund prowled the docks, eager to confront any new foe. Davos returned from a brief trip to Bravos, reporting that the Iron Bank was concerned but still supportive of the Concord, at least publicly. Tension thrummed in the air like a drawn bowstring. When the delegates arrived, White Harbor became a cauldron of politics once more. Bravosi bankers in black robes rubbed shoulders with Pentashi magisters in flamboyant silks. Marish captains walked side by side with Lyseni courtesans, both eyeing each other with wary civility. A small retinue from Volantis, smoldering with the pride of an ancient city, joined them, though they still had not fully renounced their old ways of labor. And from King's Landing came a group of lords, led by Tyrion. With him traveled Lord Giles Rosby, a minor but influential Crownlands noble, and Lady Paramore of the Stormlands. Their presence drew curious stares. Rarely did southern lords venture so far north to meet foreigners on equal terms. The council convened in a great hall near the harbor, adorned with fresh banners and ringed by northern guards. Sansa oversaw the welcoming ceremonies, skillfully blending a hint of northern austerity with the diplomatic courtesy the Essosi expected. Even Tormund wore slightly more refined garb. Though he sneered at the fuss, he complied for Jon's sake. Ghost prowled at the edges of the chamber, keeping a silent vigil. At the dais, Jon stood flanked by Sansa and Davos. The delegates sat around a vast oval table. Tyrion was among them, a neutral observer from the Crown's perspective. The session opened with formalities, reports on the Stepstones, on the partial settlement in Lys, on trade volumes. Tensions simmered just beneath the surface, but for a while, civility reigned. Then came the subject everyone had waited for: the infiltration of conspirators, the sabotage attempts, the infiltration of pirates, and the murky references to Ironborn or Westerosi sponsors. Arya, stepping forward from the shadows, presented coded documents gleaned from Lys, cross-referencing them with reports from Bravos and confessions from captured pirates. The evidence painted a picture of collusion among some Ironborn captains, financed by ambiguous parties in the Westerlands, or possibly the Crownlands, aided by Tyroshi mercenaries. The aim was to destabilize key points of the Concord, Bravos, Pentos, Mir, Lys, and keep the North entangled in foreign entanglements, leaving it vulnerable to raids on its western coast. Murmurs spread throughout the hall. Cero Nolar of Bravos demanded that this conspiracy be stamped out. Magister Erothi of Pentos warned that their city would not tolerate sabotage. The Mirish captains brandished their readiness to strike back. The Lyseni delegates nodded somberly, recalling the near-civil war that had been stoked by outside coin. Volantis took a more aloof stance, urging caution but offering no direct commitment. Finally, the Crownlands representatives, including Tyrion, listened carefully. Lord Rosby expressed shock that Westerosi lords might be involved. Lady Paramore frowned, eyes shrewd, questioning the evidence's authenticity. Tyrion cleared his throat. As representative of King Bran, I must say these revelations are alarming, Tyrion began. If any lord of the Seven Kingdoms is proven to have funded attacks on signatories of the Concord, that lord would be committing treason against the Crown's peace. King Bran does not condone such actions. However, we must be sure of the facts. Accusations alone won't suffice to move against a lord of the realm. Oh. Jon met Tyrion's gaze. We understand. We don't seek to spread false rumors. But the evidence is strong. If we can confirm a specific house, be it in the Westerlands or the Iron Islands. We ask that the Crown join us in taking action, because sabotage against the Concord is sabotage against the North, and the North remains part of the realm, even if it has broad alliances overseas." Tyrion dipped his head, a small concession. "Yes. The Crown will investigate these allegations. Should we find proof that a particular lord conspired to attack the North and its allies, we'll require them to answer for their crimes." Dubber. Lord Rosby gave an uneasy cough. "And if the culprit is not found, or if multiple lords are involved?" Sansa's voice was cool, but steady. "Then King Bran must decide if he will uphold justice, or allow the realm to fracture. We do not want war, but we won't stand by while outside forces undermine our allies and ravage our coasts." A hush fell. The foreign delegates studied the exchange intently. Bravos and Pentos in particular wanted to see whether the Crown was truly committed to supporting the North's cause, or simply paying lip service. Moments later, Tormund rose, unable to restrain himself. "If these ironborn dogs keep attacking our shores, we'll sail to the Iron Islands ourselves and remind them how the free folk repay treachery." He grinned savagely. "I'm sick of hearing they're unstoppable at sea. We bested them before." Jon cast Tormund a warning look, but the large man only shrugged. Tyrion inserted a polite cough. "Let's hope it won't come to that." They spent the rest of the council session hammering out a strategy. A joint task force would investigate the infiltration thoroughly, shared among Bravos, Pentos, Myr, and the North. Lys, still in the process of reorganizing, agreed to cooperate by turning over any suspicious shipping records. The Crownlands delegation promised to inform King Bran and begin discreet inquiries among the Westerlands lords, particularly those suspected of harboring old grudges against the Starks. The Iron Islands would be approached diplomatically at first, seeking clarity from Lord Harlaw or whomever held sway, but prepared for a harsher response if raiding continued. By the time the council concluded, the atmosphere was tense yet resolute. The Concord refused to be cowed. The foreign delegates departed to their respective enclaves, some to remain in White Harbor a while, others to sail home with the new directives. Tyrion lingered, conversing quietly with Jon and Sansa, promising to expedite communications to King Bran. They parted on amicable terms, though the undercurrent of uncertainty ran deep. That night, Jon found himself in Winterfell's old solar, transported there in memory, alone. He had decided to return to Winterfell for a short interval, at Sansa's urging, to keep a visible presence in the seat of the North. White Harbor was the mercantile heart of their alliances, but Winterfell remained the spiritual heart of House Stark. Ghost trotted beside him through the familiar corridors, memories tugging at him. How many years had passed since the days when Ned Stark was Warden of the North, and Jon was an awkward boy yearning for acceptance. He settled in the solar where a fire crackled in the hearth. The room smelled of the polished wood and old books. Outside, snow drifted gently, dusting the courtyard. He was home. Yet the weight he carried was heavier than any in the histories of House Stark. He was not just the king in the North. He was the reluctant linchpin of a vast confederation that stretched across seas. Sansa entered quietly, dressed in a warm cloak, her breath forming little puffs of vapor in the cold air. She set a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Are you all right?" He gazed into the fire's dancing flames. "I'm worried. About conspirators. About war. About what happens if we can't stop the sabotage. The Concord has achieved so much, but if it fractures, we'll see bloodshed on a scale that might dwarf the wars we remember." She took a seat beside him. "We knew it wouldn't be easy. But we've also seen that each time the Concord is tested, it survives. Because people want this alliance. They see it as a shield, a path to prosperity. That desire might be stronger than the plots of a few treacherous lords." "And?" Jon gave a soft grunt. "We'll soon find out. Arya's evidence points to the Westerlands. If King Bran uncovers a major house behind this, we could be thrust into a confrontation that might drag the entire realm into war." Sansa's gaze flickered with understanding. "And if the Crown fails to act, we'll be forced to defend ourselves and our allies, leading to the same outcome." Jon closed his eyes briefly. Duty, honor, Oh, family. We can't abandon them, nor can we abandon the allies we've forged. The best we can do is keep forging a path forward, hoping for peace, prepared for war. Melpom Soar. She touched his hand. I'll stand with you whatever comes. House Stark will not shrink from what must be done. John inclined his head, grateful. In that moment, he felt the ghosts of their parents, of Robb, even of all those who had fallen, looking upon them with quiet approval. The old ways and the new converged here, in Winterfell, in the hearts of two siblings who had endured so much. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a gentle hush over the courtyard. Beyond the walls of Winterfell, beyond the coasts of the north, across the narrow sea, a tapestry of intrigue and ambition stretched wide. If this was to be the forging of a new age, an age not of iron but of cooperation, then the hammer blows would come from every direction. John resolved to meet them, as he had always done, with whatever strength he could muster. Word trickled in over the next weeks. A crown inquiry headed by Tyrion had quietly begun questioning certain lords in the Westerlands. The Iron Islands teetered between vague denials of wrongdoing and half-hearted promises to rein in rogue captains. Braavosi agents traced suspicious coin flows, some linking back to Tyrosh. The Triarchs of Volantis, seeing a potential advantage, tried to angle for more influence in the Concord by providing intelligence on any ships passing through their waters. Meanwhile, Lys stabilized further, grateful to the Concord for preventing complete collapse. Their new ruling council was inches away from signing a formal membership pact which would bring them fully under the Concord's umbrella. Each piece of news carried the same underlying message. The realm's future hung on a knife's edge. Unity or fragmentation, prosperity or devastation. And at the center of it, Jon Snow, once a nameless bastard boy, stood as the figure many turned to in crisis. An emperor in all but name, though he repudiated crowns and pomp. Did that matter? Some said that power came from the will of those who believed in one's leadership, not from coronations. Others whispered that eventually, the Concord would demand a single figurehead to codify its empire. Jon did not want that. But he had learned that destiny often cared little for personal preference. When at last the first buds of spring began to appear, timid green shoots poking through the melting snow, Jon decided it was time to return to White Harbor once more, to oversee the next phase of negotiations and defenses. Sansa accompanied him, determined to see the final stage of Lys membership pact. Ghost bounded ahead of their party on the road, scaring a flock of crows from a bare field. The crisp air felt bracing, full of possibility. Traveling through the north, they saw the changes wrought by the Concord's prosperity. Better roads, more robust farmhouses, traders from distant lands passing in caravans. Small folk recognized them and waved shyly, or bowed, or called out blessings. At White Harbor, the bustle was greater than ever. Delegates from Lys had already arrived, eager to formalize ties. Braavosi bankers pressed for new investments, while Myrish craftsmen showcased improved forging techniques. Pentoshi magisters scoured trade logs to optimize shipping routes. All the while, rumors swirled that Tyrion had nearly pinned down a certain Westerlands lord who might be deeply enmeshed in the sabotage. Jon threw himself into the negotiations with determination, ensuring that Lys membership included provisions against the slavery or forced servitude that many suspected still occurred behind closed doors. The Lyseni delegates balked, insisting that anything resembling slavery had long been abolished. Jon pressed them for transparency. Tension rose, but a compromise was reached. The Concord would have inspectors in Lys, verifying that all laborers were free. In return, Lys gained full trade privileges and naval protection. When the membership pact was finally signed in a public ceremony by the harbor, cheers went up from both Lyseni and Northerners, mingled with applause from Pentoshi, Braavosi, and Myrish onlookers. Jon breathed a quiet sigh of relief. Another link in the chain was forged. The city of Lys, once known primarily for pleasure houses and labyrinthine intrigues, now stood on the path to stable prosperity within the Concord's fold. Tormund raised a mug of ale to celebrate, while Davos offered a more dignified toast of spiced wine. Sansa, radiant with calm satisfaction, accepted the Lyseni delegation's thanks on behalf of House Stark. Arya, flitting at the edges of the crowd, simply gave Jon a nod of approval. That night, White Harbor erupted in celebration. Lanterns adorned the docks, taverns overflowed with revelers, and street performers entertained throngs of onlookers. Sailors from Myr sang bawdy songs in broken common tongue, while Braavosi minstrels plucked stringed instruments with soulful flair. A group of Lyseni dancers performed swirling routines near the steps of the Merman's court, drawing gasps of delight. Sansa and Jon, never once for ostentatious displays, kept to a quieter gathering in the high tower with close allies. There, in a courtyard strung with lights, they shared a modest feast and drank to the hope that this membership pact marked a turning point, proof that the Concord could expand peacefully, offering security without tyranny. Amid the laughter and clinking cups, Tyrion's arrival went almost unnoticed until he cleared his throat. He stood at the threshold of the courtyard, flanked by a single Crownlands guard. He looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed. Jon rose, motioning him forward. Conversations hushed. Tyrion entered, bowed slightly. "Sorry for the interruption. I bear tidings from King's Landing." "Next rations. From Dels A." Jon gestured for him to join them. Concern etched on his face. "Good or bad?" Tyrion took a measured breath. "A mix, as always. The good news: King Bran supports your cause. He has found enough evidence to believe that certain lords in the Westerlands have been supplying funds to Ironborn raiders and Tyroshi mercenaries, hoping to destabilize the North and the Concord. The Crown stands ready to assist in apprehending those responsible." A wave of relief mingled with tension. Davos let out a low whistle. Sansa's jaw tightened. Arya, near the back, narrowed her eyes. Tormund grunted in approval. Jon nodded slowly. "That's better than we feared. Does the Crown know which lords?" Tyrion's lips thinned. "Lord Clifton is among the worst offenders, as suspected. But he's not alone. Others may have shielded him. King Bran's approach is to demand they answer for their crimes at the Great Council. However, if they resist, it could lead to open conflict. Some in the Westerlands feel the Crown is bowing to Northern and foreign. Jon felt the gravity of the moment. "We'll stand beside Bran if it comes to that. This sabotage threatens us all." "No, Tyrion nodded. "Then we come to the less hopeful news. The Ironborn have declared they will not submit to any investigation by the Crown or the Concord. Lord Harlaw has seized control of certain isles, and they're rallying raiders. They claim the old ways give them the right to reave. If the Crown tries to force them to comply, they vow to raid the western coast. Merciless." Sansa's voice was quiet. "War, then?" Tyrion grimaced. "Possibly. Bran hopes to avoid it, but the Ironborn appear defiant, and the conspirators in the Westerlands might be emboldening them. King Bran requests that Jon come to King's Landing to stand before the Great Council and reaffirm the North's cooperation, so no one can claim these accusations are baseless or that you're using the Crown as a puppet." "Nay." Jon exchanged a glance with Sansa. "If that's what it takes, but traveling to King's Landing under these circumstances, are we sure it's safe?" Tyrion offered a tight smile. "Safe enough. I'll vouch for your protection, as will King Bran. The question is, will you do it?" "Next fail." Jon looked around at his companions, reading the uncertainty in their eyes. Even Tormund seemed subdued at the prospect of so bold a move. Sansa reached for Jon's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "If you believe it will help maintain peace, you should go. I'll remain here and keep the Concord running." He nodded slowly, heart heavy. He thought of the last time he had gone south to treat with the powers in King's Landing. That had led to heartbreak, betrayal, and the chain of events, culminating in Daenerys' tragic downfall. Now, with King Bran on the throne, times were different. Yet the city still bristled with courtly intrigue. "I'll do it," Jon said, voice low. "For the sake of the realm we're building. But let's not be naive. This could be the tipping point." Tyrion's eyes reflected the same worry. "I know. But if we do nothing, we risk the realm sliding back into chaos. John turned to the group assembled. Davos, Sansa, Arya, Tormund, and a few other trusted allies. Then I go south in a fortnight. Arya, will you come? She nodded. I'll watch your back. Sansa clasped Jon's arm. We'll hold things here. Be careful. Demetrol. And so, even in the midst of the celebration at White Harbor, the seeds of a new journey were planted. Jon would return to King's Landing, not as a supplicant or a prisoner, but as the voice of a confederation spanning 2 continents. If the Great Council recognized the legitimacy of the Concord, it could mark the start of a lasting peace. If not, the collisions of power might tear the 7 kingdoms asunder once again, dragging Essos into the maelstrom. Jon stepped away from the group, looking out over the harbor where lanterns bobbed on ships at rest. Ghosts came to stand beside him, ears perked. The future was murky, full of perils and possibilities. Yet he recalled the promise he made by the heart tree, to protect the living, to guide them toward a future free of the nightmares of the past. He would go to King's Landing bearing that oath in his heart. The realm needed unity, needed hope, needed someone willing to stand at the crossroads of East and West and refuse to let darkness prevail. Tomorrow would come with fresh challenges, no doubt. But tonight, for a fleeting moment, Jon allowed himself to feel the warmth of the lanterns and the distant strains of music drifting from the harbor. He had built this fragile peace with the help of so many, forging bonds between those once divided. Let it endure. He prayed silently. Let the realm find a way beyond war, beyond betrayal. Let them stand as one people, stronger than fear, bound by the threads of cooperation and mutual respect. If that dream was worth anything, it was worth risking everything for. So he would. And perhaps in years to come, the children of Westeros and Essos would look upon the distant north, once a realm of endless winter, and see instead the place where a new dawn rose.